1918. Fall asleep to hilarious history. The Fever, the Front, and the 11th Hour. By Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Spanish Misnomer. By the time 1918 rolled around, the human race had become thoroughly acquainted with the business of dying, though it must be said we had previously preferred to do it by hand. We had spent 4 years inventing increasingly expensive and noisy ways to shuffle off this mortal coil. Trench mortars, mustard gas, and airplanes that dropped metal eggs with a most discouraging frequency. Man, in his infinite wisdom, had decided that the old-fashioned way of expiring of a simple heart attack or a peaceful tumble down the stairs was altogether too quiet for the modern age. We wanted spectacle. We wanted a climax. And then, just as we were patting ourselves on the back for our industriousness in the art of carnage, nature decided to show us that when it comes to mass production, a human being with a bayonet is a mere amateur compared to a microbe with a mission. The genesis of the Great Sneeze. It began, as so many catastrophes do, in Kansas. Now, I have nothing particular against Kansas other than the fact that it is remarkably flat and tends to produce winds that can blow the whiskers right off a man's face if he isn't leaning at a 45-degree angle. But in March of 1918, at a place called Camp Funston, a cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the infirmary complaining of a fever, a sore throat, and a headache. Now, if Albert had been a general, his headache might have changed the course of a battle. But because he was a cook, his headache changed the course of the world. By noon that day, over 100 of his fellow soldiers were horizontal, and by the end of the week, the infirmary was so full they were stacking privates like cordwood. It is a solemn thought, as I have often observed, that the most significant events in history frequently begin with a man who simply wants to lay down and have a quiet moan. The boys at Camp Funston were, at that very moment, being polished and shined to go over to Europe and save democracy, or whatever was left of it after the Kaiser had finished his breakfast. They were packed into trains, huddling together for warmth and companionship, sharing their stories, their tobacco, and, most generously, their brand-new Kansas germs. They steamed across the Atlantic in ships so crowded that a man couldn't change his mind without hitting 3 other people in the jaw. By the time they landed in France, they weren't just bringing liberty, they were bringing a respiratory revolution. The silence of the sphinxes. Now, you might wonder why. If the plague started in the American Midwest and took a tour of the French trenches, we don't call it the Jayhawk jitters or the Kansas cough. The reason is simple, and it highlights the peculiar vanity of the warring nations. In 1918, the world was divided into 2 camps, those who were busy being shot and those who were busy doing the shooting. Both sides had a very strict policy regarding the news. If it didn't involve a glorious victory or a heroic sacrifice, it didn't exist. To admit that your soldiers were dying of a common cold, even a very uncommon lung-melting cold, was considered bad for morale. It made the heroic business of war look like a messy business of biology. The British papers were as silent as a tomb. The French editors wouldn't have mentioned a cough if it had rattled the windows of the Louvre, and the Germans were far too occupied with their spring offensive to admit that their troops were currently more interested in thermometers than telescopes. England, everything is splendid. Pay no attention to the sneezing in the barracks. France, our men are invincible. Please disregard the fact that half the regiment is currently turning blue. America, we are bringing the Kansas spirit to the Rhine, and also the Kansas fever. The truth was being smothered by a pillow of patriotism. Every nation was wearing a blindfold and pretending that the Grim Reaper wasn't currently trading in his scythe for a bottle of aspirin. The Spanish Confession. Then there was Spain. Spain, bless its heart, was neutral. It wasn't interested in the trenches, the barbed wire, or the question of who owned which particular patch of mud in Belgium. Because they weren't at war, they didn't have any censors. They didn't have a government official standing over every printing press with a red pen and a scowl. When the flu hit Madrid, the Spanish newspapers did something radical, something entirely unheard of in the year 1918. They told the truth. They reported that the king, Alfonso XIII, had come down with a nasty bout of the grip. They described the symptoms, the bone-crushing fatigue, the purple spots on the cheeks, the feeling that a mule had kicked you repeatedly in the chest. They gave the thing front-page billing because, frankly, there wasn't much else going on in Madrid other than the occasional bullfight. The rest of the world, peering over their own censored headlines, saw the reports from Spain and let out a collective sigh of relief. "Aha!" they cried. "Look at those poor Spaniards. They've got a terrible plague over there. It's a good thing we're all perfectly healthy here in London and Paris and New York, except for these 10,000 soldiers who are currently being buried behind the shed." And so, with the swiftness of a gossip in a small town, the disease was christened. It became the Spanish flu. It didn't matter that the Spanish were merely the only ones honest enough to admit they were sick. In the court of public opinion, the man who reports the fire is almost always blamed for holding the match. A lesson in nomenclature. There is a profound irony in naming a global catastrophe after the only country that wasn't trying to hide it. It is as if you were at a dinner party where everyone had accidentally sat on a piece of chocolate cake, but only one guest was brave enough to point out the stain on his trousers, whereupon the rest of the table immediately dubbed it the Sanchez spot, and continued to pretend their own backsides were as clean as a whistle. Spain tried to protest. They called it the Soldier of Naples, after a popular song of the time that was catchy and hard to get out of your head, much like the virus. But the world wasn't listening. Spanish flu had a ring to it. It sounded exotic, dangerous, and, most importantly, it sounded like it belonged to someone else. The virus itself didn't care what it was called. It didn't have a passport, and it didn't favor any particular flag. It moved through the trenches like a ghost, ignoring the no-man's land that the generals had so carefully cordoned off. It infected the snipers and the cooks, the poets and the politicians. It proved, once and for all, that while men may be divided by geography, religion, and the desire to wear different colored hats, we are all perfectly unified in our ability to develop a fever of 104. As the year progressed, the Great War began to look like a minor squabble compared to the Great Sneeze. The guns were still firing, yes, but the men behind them were beginning to wonder if the enemy was the fellow in the other trench or the invisible intruder in their own lungs. It was a year of profound absurdity. We were spending millions of dollars to kill each other with high explosives, while a microscopic organism that couldn't even sign its own name was doing the job for free and with much greater efficiency. We had entered the age of the machine gun, only to find ourselves defeated by the age of the mucous membrane. And all the while, the poor King of Spain sat in his palace, sipping broth and wondering why, of all the things his ancestors had conquered, he was going to be remembered most for a runny nose. The moral of the misnomer. The lesson here, if there is one, and I generally find that history is quite allergic to lessons, is that honesty is a dangerous virtue. If you are the only one in a room of liars who admits to having a hole in your sock, you will forever be known as the man with the toe. By the end of 1918, the flu would claim more lives than the war itself. It would jump from Kansas to France, from France to Spain, and from Spain to the rest of the weary, sneezing world. It was a tragedy of errors, a comedy of horrors, and a testament to the fact that the human race is never so united as when it is collectively falling apart. But for now, in the early months of that fateful year, it was simply the Spanish lady, a mysterious visitor who had supposedly come from the Pyrenees, when in fact she had been born and raised on a steady diet of Kansas corn and army rations. The war was nearing its end, but the fever was just getting started, and the 11th hour was still a long, breathless way off. Chapter 2. The Anti-Mask League of San Francisco. By the autumn of 1918, the city of San Francisco had already survived a great fire, a catastrophic earthquake, and several decades of being populated by gold-crazed prospectors and maritime ruffians. It was a city that considered itself rugged, indestructible, and perhaps a little bit more enlightened than the rest of the world, owing to its proximity to the Pacific Ocean and a very high concentration of fog. But as the Spanish lady, that uninvited Kansas guest we discussed previously, began to wend her way through the Golden Gate, the city's bravado was put to a test that no earthquake could match. The city fathers, led by a mayor who possessed the unenviable task of trying to govern a populace that viewed rules as mere suggestions, decided that the only way to keep the city from becoming one giant infirmary was to mandate the wearing of masks. Now, a mask in 1918 was not the sleek, blue, synthetic affair we might see in a modern surgery. It was a 4-layer rectangle of surgical gauze, tied behind the head with strings that had a malicious tendency to knot themselves into the hair of anyone with a sense of vanity. To the Board of Health, it was a simple matter of physics and filter. To the citizens of San Francisco, it was an invitation to a revolution. The Great Muffling. On a brisk October morning, the ordinance went into effect. Suddenly, a city that prided itself on its expressive faces, faces that could bluff a royal flush or charm the birds out of the redwoods, was transformed into a silent congregation of muffled bandits. Every man, woman, and child was required by law to wear what was affectionately known as a flu muffler. If you walked down Market Street, you didn't see neighbors. You saw eyes peering over white barricades of calico and gauze. The city looked like it was preparing for a mass bank robbery, or perhaps a very somber masquerade ball, where the only costume available was Anonymous Patient Number 4. The police, of course, were given the task of enforcement. Now, A San Francisco policeman is a man who has dealt with dock strikes and opium dens, but even he felt a certain spiritual heaviness when told he had to arrest a grandmother for the crime of letting her nose peek out into the fresh air. The jails began to fill with mask slackers. These were not hardened criminals, but rather people who found that breathing through 4 layers of damp cotton made them feel as though they were attempting to inhale a thick wool blanket during a rainstorm. There is nothing quite like a government mandate, I have often mused, to turn a perfectly law-abiding citizen into a man who would rather die of a plague than be told how to dress his own face. The birth of the League. As the weeks wore on, the novelty of looking like a mummy wore off, and a certain segment of the population began to itch. It wasn't just the gauze that was itching, it was their sense of liberty. In a city that had been built on the idea of doing exactly as one pleased, the notion that a doctor could tell a freeborn American how to exhale was viewed by some as the first step toward a monarchy. Thus was born the Anti-Mask League of San Francisco. The League was a peculiar collection of individuals. It included a few legitimate physicians who thought the masks were about as effective as trying to stop a swarm of mosquitoes with a picket fence, a smattering of civil libertarians who believed the Constitution guaranteed the right to sneeze wherever one chose, and a great many people who simply hated the way the strings felt behind their ears. The leader of this merry band of malcontents was a woman named Mrs. E. C. Harrington. She was a woman of formidable spirit and a voice that could likely have been heard in Oakland without the aid of a telephone. She declared that the mask ordinance was un-American, sanitarily useless, and, most damning of all, an affront to the dignity of the human countenance. The League didn't just grumble in the corners of saloons. They organized, they printed pamphlets, they held a mass meeting at the Dreamland Rink, which is exactly the sort of name you want for a place where people gather to discuss how to ignore a global pandemic. The Dreamland Delusion. Imagine, if you will, several thousand people crammed into a skating rink, many of them wearing their masks around their chins like a decorative beard, all cheering for the right to breathe on one another. Mrs. Harrington stood upon the platform and gave a speech that would have made Patrick Henry blush with envy, though Patrick Henry generally focused his "give me liberty" or "give me death" speeches on the British rather than on a piece of cheesecloth. The arguments presented at the Dreamland Rink were masterpieces of human logic. One speaker suggested that the masks actually trapped the germs, creating a sort of bacterial greenhouse right under the nose. Another argued that the law was a conspiracy by the gauze manufacturers to move their surplus inventory. A third suggested that since the virus was invisible, it clearly didn't exist, and therefore the masks were merely a psychological yoke designed to break the will of the people. It was a spectacular display of the human mind's ability to find a complicated reason to avoid a simple inconvenience. The League signed a petition, which they presented to the Board of Supervisors, demanding that the muzzle law be repealed immediately. They argued that the death rate hadn't dropped significantly since the masks were introduced, conveniently ignoring the fact that half the city was wearing their masks with holes cut out for cigars, or only putting them on when they saw a policeman approaching. The victory of the barefaced. Eventually, the pressure became too great. Whether the politicians grew tired of the shouting or whether they truly believed the danger had passed, the mask ordinance was rescinded in late November. The scene that followed was described by witnesses as a saturnalia of the unmuzzled. People stood on street corners and ripped the gauze from their faces with the fervor of prisoners being released from the Bastille. The gutters of San Francisco were white with discarded masks. People hugged, they kissed, and they breathed deeply of the foggy air, celebrating their hard-won victory over the tyranny of hygiene. "We have won," cried the League. "The face is free. The nose is liberated." It was a grand and glorious moment of human triumph. It lasted exactly long enough for the virus to realize that the barriers had been removed and the buffet was once again open for business. Within weeks, the second wave hit San Francisco with a ferocity that made the first one look like a mild case of the sniffles. The death rate didn't just climb, it took a vertical leap. The hospitals, which had begun to breathe a sigh of relief, were suddenly overwhelmed. The city fathers, looking sheepish and sounding muffled, had to reinstitute the mask law in January. But this time, the Anti-Mask League was strangely quiet. It turns out that it is very difficult to maintain a spirited protest against a respiratory mandate when a significant portion of your membership is currently occupying a hospital bed or a cemetery plot. The eternal stubbornness of man. The story of the Anti-Mask League is not just a footnote in the history of 1918. It is a timeless portrait of the human animal in its natural state. We are a species that will spend hours constructing a mechanical marvel that can fly through the clouds and then spend the next day arguing that a piece of string is a threat to our fundamental existence. The San Franciscans of that era weren't particularly foolish or particularly brave. They were simply human. They lived in a world that was changing too fast, where death came on the wind, and the government's best solution was to tell everyone to dress like a highwayman. They wanted their faces back. They wanted to see their neighbors smile. They wanted to believe that if they just ignored the invisible, it would eventually go away. As I look back on that year of the Great Muffle, I am reminded that the greatest struggle in history isn't between nations or empires, or even between man and microbe. It is the eternal, exhausting struggle between a man's common sense and his desire to not have his ears pulled forward by a piece of elastic. 1918 was a year of many tragedies, but the Anti-Mask League remains its most whimsical folly, a reminder that even in the face of a global catastrophe, the American spirit will always find time to form a committee and complain about the laundry. The Spanish lady continued her tour, oblivious to the petitions and the protests. She didn't care for the Dreamland Rink, and she had no opinion on the Constitution. She just kept moving, leaving a trail of sneezes and silence in her wake, while the world prepared for the next great absurdity. Woodrow Wilson's plan to fix the planet with 14 points and a very large amount of optimism. Chapter 3. The 14 Points of Perfection. If you ever find yourself in the company of a man who believes he can reform the human race by means of a numbered list, my advice is to check your pockets and quietly head for the nearest exit. There is something about a list, especially one that reaches double digits, that brings out the latent schoolmaster in a man. And there is no creature on God's green earth more dangerous than a schoolmaster who has accidentally been put in charge of an army. By January of 1918, the United States was led by a man named Woodrow Wilson. Now, Mr. Wilson was a gentleman of high character, scholarly disposition, and a pair of spectacles that seemed to have been forged in the very fires of Presbyterian rectitude. Before he took up the trade of president, he had been a college professor, which is a profession dedicated to the belief that if you talk at people long enough in a sufficiently vaulted room, they will eventually stop behaving like savages. It was a noble theory, but by the 4th year of the Great War, the world was less like a classroom and more like a waterfront saloon at 2 in the morning, after the whiskey is run out and someone has insulted someone else's mother. The old world was a tangled mess of secret handshakes, blood feuds, and ancient maps that looked like they had been drawn by a spider on a bender. And into this smoke-filled room stepped Professor Wilson, clutching a piece of paper and looking for a chalkboard. The Moral Gymnasium. On the 8th of January, Wilson stood before a joint session of Congress to deliver what would become known as the 14 Points. It was, for all intents and purposes, a 14-step program for a planet that wasn't quite ready to admit it had hit rock bottom. Wilson's idea was simple, in the way that leaping off a cliff is a simple way to reach the bottom. He wanted to make the world safe for democracy. This is a lovely sentiment, provided you can find enough people who want to be safe and a sufficient quantity of democracy to go round. He imagined a future where nations didn't settle their differences with bayonets and mustard gas, but with polite conversation and perhaps a very sternly worded letter. The 14 Points were a masterpiece of American optimism, that peculiar brand of sunshine that believes every problem can be solved with a committee and a clear set of bylaws. Point 1. No more secret treaties. Everything was to be open covenants, openly arrived at. This was a direct attack on the very foundations of European diplomacy, which for centuries had operated on the principle that if you weren't whispering behind a velvet curtain, you weren't actually governing. Point 2. Absolute freedom of navigation upon the seas. This was Wilson's way of telling the British Navy to mind its own business and the German U-boats to stop behaving like disgruntled sharks. Point 5. An impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. This was a polite way of suggesting that perhaps the great empires of Europe should stop treating the rest of the world like a private pantry. To the war-weary citizens of the world, these points sounded like a choir of angels. To the seasoned politicians of London and Paris, they sounded like a man trying to sell insurance to a house that was currently engulfed in flames. The Sunday School of Nations. The crown jewel of Wilson's list, the 14th point, was the proposal for a League of Nations. This was to be a grand assembly where the countries of the world would sit down, hash out their grievances, and presumably share a nice pot of tea. It was to be a Parliament of Man, a place where the lion would lie down with the lamb, and the lamb would actually get a full night's sleep without worrying about the lion's breakfast schedule. Now, I have seen a good deal of human nature in my time on the river and elsewhere, and I have observed that when you put 100 men in a room to discuss the common good, you usually end up with 99 different definitions of good and one man who is made off with the gavel. But Wilson believed in the inherent rationality of the human spirit. He believed that if you gave a Bulgarian and a Greek a comfortable chair and a common goal, they would forget 500 years of wanting to poke each other's eyes out. A man who thinks he can stop a war with a league, I might have remarked, is the same kind of man who thinks he can stop a Mississippi flood by reading the water a very moving poem about the beauty of dry land. Wilson wasn't just a politician, he was a visionary. The trouble with visionaries is that they often have their eyes so firmly fixed on the stars that they fail to notice the very large, very muddy ditch right in front of their feet. He was offering the world a map of heaven while they were still trying to figure out how to survive in the other place. The Tiger and the Lamb. The reaction from Europe was a study in polite bewilderment. Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, was known as the Tiger. He was a man who had seen the Germans march through his country twice in his lifetime and had a heart that was approximately the consistency of a well-aged brick. When he heard about the 14 points, Clemenceau is said to have sighed and remarked, "The good Lord only had 10. The Europeans were cynical, scarred, and deeply interested in things that weren't on Wilson's list, things like revenge, reparations, and making sure the fellow next door never breathes comfortably again. They looked at Wilson as a wealthy uncle who had arrived late to the funeral and started telling everyone how to redecorate the parlor. David Lloyd George, Britain, was worried about the freedom of the seas bit, as Britain's idea of freedom was being free to control all the seas. Vittorio Orlando, Italy, was mainly looking for the piece of the map he had been promised in a secret treaty, the very kind of treaty Wilson wanted to abolish. Despite the skepticism of the elites, the common people of the world fell in love with Wilson. In the mud of the trenches and the hunger of the cities, the 14 points represented a hope that the slaughter might actually mean something. They didn't see a college professor. They saw a savior in a frock coat. The great idealist's burden. Wilson's tragedy was that he truly believed his own rhetoric. He thought that the power of right was naturally superior to the power of might, a theory that has been disproven by every schoolyard bully since the dawn of time. He was a man of the word in a world of the sword. As 1918 progressed, the 14 points became the moral compass of the Allied cause. They gave the soldiers something to fight for other than survival, and they gave the Germans an out, a promise that if they surrendered, they wouldn't be treated like a conquered province, but like a wayward brother who just needed a good talking to. But a list is a fragile thing. It is made of paper and ink, and it can be torn, smudged, or ignored. Wilson was preparing for a peace conference that was still months away, while the German High Command was preparing for one last, desperate roll of the dice. The professor had finished his lecture and set down his chalk. He had given the world a blueprint for a cathedral of peace. Now, all he had to do was find someone willing to build it without stealing the bricks or setting fire to the scaffolding. And as the winter snow began to melt in the spring of 1918, it became clear that before the world could learn to walk in Wilson's 14 steps, it was going to have to run for its life. The stage was set for a final bloody act. The 14 points were floating in the air like dandelion seeds, beautiful and light, while on the Western Front, the iron weight of history was preparing to drop. Chapter 4. The Spring Offensive, Operation Michael. There is something about the arrival of an American that is inherently loud, even when he is trying to be quiet. By the spring of 1918, The Atlantic Ocean was positively teeming with young men from places like Peoria and Poughkeepsie who had been told that Europe was a picturesque vacation spot that merely required a bit of light gardening with a bayonet to be set right. They were arriving at a rate of 10,000 a day, strapping, well-fed lads who looked like they had never missed a Sunday dinner in their lives, and who possessed an alarming amount of enthusiasm for a continent that had spent the last 4 years trying to commit suicide. To the German High Command, this was a most distressing development. It is one thing to fight a war against neighbors who are just as tired, hungry, and covered in lice as you are. It is quite another to look across no man's land and see a fresh million people who have just arrived and are asking where they might find the nearest Kaiser so they can give him a piece of their mind. General Erich Ludendorff, a man whose face was so perpetually grim it looked as though it had been carved out of a particularly sour potato, realized that Germany was like a gambler who had spent 4 years playing a losing hand and was now down to his last pair of trousers. He knew that if he didn't win the game by summer, the sheer weight of American ham and enthusiasm would flatten the German Empire into a very thin pancake. And so he decided to throw everything, the kitchen sink, the plumbing, and the very foundation of the house, into one final spectacular and utterly desperate roll of the dice. The Schoolmaster of Slaughter. The plan was called Operation Michael. Why, Michael, no one is entirely sure, though I suspect Operation We Are Very Worried About the Americans was considered too long for a telegram. It was to be the greatest offensive in the history of the world. Ludendorff's strategy was to strike the British lines with such ferocity that they would be knocked clear into the English Channel, leaving the French to wander about in a state of confused solitude until they eventually surrendered. To achieve this, Ludendorff invented something called stormtrooper tactics. Now, I must clarify for the benefit of future generations that these were not the fellows in white plastic armor who can't hit a barn door with a laser pistol. These were elite, nimble soldiers who were taught to ignore the main army and simply run as fast as they could into the enemy's backyard, causing as much tomfoolery and chaos as possible. They were armed with light machine guns, grenades, and a profound lack of regard for their own longevity. The British, meanwhile, were dug into their trenches with the stubbornness of a mule that has decided it doesn't like the look of the road ahead. They had spent 3 years turning the French countryside into a complicated arrangement of mud and barbed wire, and they were quite settled. They had their tea, they had their tinned beef, and they had a general belief that the Hun was just as exhausted as they were. They were wrong. The fog of war and other inconveniences. On the morning of the 21st of March, the world ended, or at the very least, it made a very convincing imitation of it. Ludendorff unleashed a bombardment of 6,000 cannons that lasted for 5 hours. It wasn't just explosives. It was a mixture of gas, smoke, and enough noise to make a deaf man wince in his sleep. And then there was the fog. Now, I have seen some fogs in my time. Fogs on the Mississippi so thick you could use them as a mattress, but this was a literal pea souper, enhanced by the soot of 6,000 guns. It was so thick that a British sentry couldn't see his own hand, let alone the 3,000 Germans who were currently jogging toward him. The storm troopers simply drifted through the mist like ghosts, appearing out of the gloom to ask for directions before politely tossing a grenade into the dugout. The British line didn't just break, it evaporated. It was the largest retreat in the history of the British Army. Men who had spent 3 years defending the same 3 yards of mud suddenly found themselves running 10 miles in a single afternoon. It was a spectacular success. For a few glorious weeks, it looked as though Ludendorff was a genius, and the Kaiser began to wonder if he might need to order a new set of medals for his chest. The problem with winning too much. However, there is a peculiar problem with winning a war too fast. You eventually run out of map. The German army was advancing so quickly that their supply wagons, which were mostly pulled by horses that looked like they belonged in a museum of anatomy, couldn't keep up. You see, the German soldier had spent the last 3 years eating something called ersatz bread, which was mostly sawdust and hope, and drinking coffee made from roasted acorns. They were thin, they were tired, and their boots were increasingly made of cardboard because all the leather in Germany had been used to make saddles for generals who never rode them. When these starving German soldiers broke through the British lines and entered the supply depots, they didn't find more mud. They found paradise. They found warehouses full of real white bread. They found tinned peaches. They found chocolate. They found vast quantities of British rum and French wine, and most importantly, they found mountains of real honest-to-goodness leather boots. The Great Spring Offensive, the masterwork of the German High Command, was brought to a grinding halt, not by a heroic counterattack, but by the irresistible allure of a tinned ham. It is a fundamental law of the universe, I have observed, that a man's stomach has no interest in his general's geography. If you offer a man the choice between capturing Paris and eating a cold pork chop, the pork chop will win every time. The Germans stopped. They didn't just stop, they feasted. They sat in the captured trenches and got wonderfully, spectacularly drunk on British gin. They marveled at the fact that the British had luxury items like soap and tobacco. They realized that they had been told the British were starving. Yet here was enough bacon to pave a road to Berlin. This did very little for their morale, but a great deal for their waistlines. The 11th hour exhaustion. By the time Ludendorff managed to get his army moving again, the momentum was gone. The storm had become a drizzle. The land they had captured was a nightmare of their own making, a churned-up wasteland of craters and debris that made moving artillery about as easy as pushing a grand piano through a swamp. Every mile they gained was a mile further away from their own kitchens and a mile closer to the French and British reinforcements. And then, looming on the horizon, like a fleet of very loud, very optimistic ghosts, came the Americans. The German army had run out of breath. They had run out of food. And most tragically of all, they had run out of shoes. You cannot conquer the world in cardboard footwear. The damp of the French morning is a far more effective defense than a machine gun when your soles are disintegrating. Operation Michael had been a spectacular success that resulted in a catastrophic failure. They had gained 40 miles of dirt, lost 250,000 men, and succeeded only in convincing the Allies that they really ought to hurry up and finish the war before the Germans ate all their peaches. Ludendorff sat in his office, staring at his map, and realized that he had thrown his last pair of trousers into the fire, and the room was still cold. The Americans were no longer a rumor. They were a reality. And as the spring of 1918 turned into summer, the German Empire began to realize that while they had been busy winning battles, they had accidentally forgotten how to win the war. The devil dogs were waiting in a place called Belleau Wood, and they hadn't brought any peaches to share. Chapter 5. Belleau Wood and the Devil Dogs. If you were to take a map of France and place your thumb upon it with a certain degree of clumsiness, you would likely cover a patch of land known as Belleau Wood. To the casual observer, in 1918, it was merely a square mile of tangled undergrowth, ancient oaks, and limestone boulders, the sort of place a sensible person might visit only if they had lost a very expensive goat. It was not a grand forest of legend, nor was it a strategic mountain peak. It was simply a thicket that happened to be standing in the way of the German army and their afternoon tea in Paris. Into this arboreal nightmare stepped the United States Marines. Now, a Marine is a peculiar breed of human being, a sort of amphibious soldier who spends half his time wishing he were on a ship and the other half proving to the world that he is entirely too stubborn to be left on land without supervision. At the time, the American Expeditionary Force was still being treated by the Europeans as a collection of well-meaning amateurs, the kind of people you invite to a barn raising but don't trust with the heavy lifting. The French, in particular, were feeling a bit frayed at the edges, having spent 4 years playing a lethal game of musical chairs with the German Empire. As the Germans pushed through the lines during their aforementioned spring offensive, the French command suggested to the arriving Americans that a tactical withdrawal might be in order. This is a very elegant European way of saying, "Run for your lives, the neighbors are coming over with bayonets." The etiquette of arriving. It was here that Captain Lloyd Williams of the 5th Marine Regiment uttered a sentence that has since been carved into the very soul of the Corps. When told by a retreating French officer that he ought to turn around and head back the way he came, Williams looked at the man with the calm bewilderment of a person who has just been told that water is wet but inconvenient. Retreat? Hell, we just got here. Now, there is a profound philosophical truth in that statement. An American will endure many things: bad coffee, questionable politics, and the Missouri summer. But he will not be told to leave a party before he has had a chance to break something. The Marines hadn't spent weeks in a damp troopship and days in a jolting cattle car just to turn around because the scenery had become a bit too explosive. They had come to see the war, and by George, they were going to sit in the front row. They marched into the woods, which were currently infested with German machine gun nests as thick as ticks on a hound dog. The Germans, for their part, were quite comfortable. They had been in the woods for a while, they had dug deep holes, and they had a very clear view of anyone foolish enough to walk across the open wheat fields that surrounded the thicket. A forest of misunderstandings. The battle for Belleau Wood was not a grand sweeping maneuver of the sort that generals like to draw on napkins at dinner. It was a messy, undignified hand-to-hand scramble in the dirt. It was a fight conducted with grenades, knives, and, on several occasions, the enthusiastic application of a heavy boot. The Marines discovered that in a forest, a front line is a purely imaginary concept. You might find a German behind a tree to your left, another in a hole to your right, and a third one dropping out of a branch directly onto your head, like a particularly disgruntled squirrel. The fighting lasted for 3 weeks. It was conducted in a constant state of, "Where did that come from?" The Marines would capture a clearing, only to find that the Germans had moved back into it the moment they looked away. It was a war of nerves, conducted in a landscape that looked like a woodpile that had been hit by lightning and then sprinkled with mustard gas. The American style of warfare at the time was characterized by a certain, let us call it, reckless exuberance. They didn't quite understand the European tradition of sitting in a trench and contemplating one's sins for 6 months. They preferred to stand up and run toward the noise. This was considered very brave by the poets, very foolish by the French, and deeply unsettling by the Germans. The birth of a brand. The Germans, as we have noted, are a people who appreciate a good descriptive noun. They have a word for almost everything, including the feeling of being embarrassed for someone else who's making a fool of themselves. But as they sat in their machine gun nests and watched these tall, lean Americans charging through a hail of lead with nothing but a grin and a bayonet, they began to search for a new term. According to legend, and I have always found that legend is much more reliable than a government report, as it has a better sense of timing, the German soldiers began to refer to these relentless attackers as Teufelhunden. Translated into the King's English, this means devil dogs. Now, there has been much debate among linguists and people with nothing better to do as to whether any German actually said this. Some suggest the Germans wouldn't use that particular grammar, or that they were more likely to use a word like Höllenhunde. But I say, let us not allow the truth to get in the way of a perfectly good nickname. If the Germans didn't say it, they certainly should have. When the news reached the Marines that the enemy had dubbed them devil dogs, they did not take offense. They did not write a letter of protest to the International Court of Etiquette. Instead, they did what any enterprising American would do. They immediately adopted it as a brand name. There is nothing an American loves more than a terrifying nickname bestowed upon him by an enemy, I have observed. It saves him the trouble of having to invent one for himself, and it carries the added weight of being an unsolicited testimonial. Suddenly, the Marines weren't just soldiers. They were mythological creatures. They were devil dogs from the pits of the New World, sent to France to chew on the Kaiser's heels. It was a brilliant bit of psychological warfare. If a man believes he is fighting a dog from hell, he is much more likely to drop his rifle and look for a tree to climb. The price of a nickname. The victory at Belleau Wood was complete by late June, but it was a victory that came at a cost that would have made a banker weep. The 4th Marine Brigade suffered more casualties in those 3 weeks than the entire Marine Corps had seen in its previous 140 years of existence. The wood was eventually renamed Bois de la Brigade de Marine by the French, which is a very lovely gesture, but most people just kept calling it Belleau Wood, or that place where the Americans went mad. The Germans realized that the amateurs from the West were a different kind of problem altogether. They weren't fighting for land or for secret treaties or for the delicate balance of European power. They were fighting because they had just got there, and they were in a very bad mood. The devil dog legend grew wings. It appeared on posters, in newspapers, and eventually on the skin of many a Marine in the form of a permanent ink illustration. It transformed the Marine Corps from a small auxiliary force into a premier fighting machine in the eyes of the world. And it all happened in a square mile of French timber that wasn't particularly good for anything else. The irony of the thicket. As the smoke cleared from Belleau Wood, the world took a long, hard look at the map. The road to Paris was closed. The German Michael had been met by an American dog. It is one of the grand ironies of history that the turning point of the Great War occurred in a forest where the combatants could rarely see more than 10 feet in front of them. We like to think of history as a series of grand speeches and carefully signed documents, but more often than not, it is determined by a group of young men who refuse to leave a patch of woods simply because they haven't finished what they started. The Marines emerged from the trees smelling of sulfur, sweat, and glory. They had earned their nickname, they had saved a city they had never seen, and they had convinced the German High Command that perhaps the American entry into the war was going to be a bit more than a cameo appearance. The Kaiser's men began to look at the sky with a new kind of dread. They had survived the winter, they had survived the mud, and they had survived the Spanish lady. But they were starting to realize that they might not survive the devil dogs. And as the summer of 1918 baked the fields of France, a new predator was preparing to take to the air, a Red Baron who was about to find out that even a knight of the clouds has to reckon with the terrestrial laws of gravity and a well-placed bullet. Chapter 6. The Red Baron Falls. Man has always had a rather complicated relationship with the sky. For several thousand years, we were perfectly content to leave the heavens to the birds and the occasional stray thunderstorm, being quite satisfied with the solid, dependable dirt beneath our boots. But by 1918, we had decided that the one thing missing from the clouds was the ability to murder one another at high altitudes. The invention of the airplane was initially hailed as a triumph of the human spirit, a way to bridge continents and bring the brotherhood of man closer together. But as it turns out, when you bring the brotherhood of man closer together, the first thing they usually do is try to find a way to poke each other in the eye. Thus, the frail, canvas-covered kites of the early century were quickly outfitted with machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller so that a pilot wouldn't accidentally shoot his own nose off. A feat of engineering that remains one of the few instances where human ingenuity was used to solve a problem that human stupidity had created in the first place. Into this thin, cold air stepped the most famous predator the world had ever seen, Manfred von Richthofen, better known to the terrified Allied airmen as the Red Baron. The Crimson Target. Richthofen was the ultimate ace, a term we use for pilots who have shot down at least 5 enemies, presumably because highly talented aerial assassin was too much of a mouthful for the morning papers. By April of 1918, the Baron had 80 confirmed victories. 80. If he had been a collector of stamps or butterflies, he would have been considered a world-class enthusiast because he was a collector of burning airplanes. He was a legend. He flew a Fokker Doctor 1 triplane, a machine that looked like a stack of 3 pancakes that had been struck by a bolt of red lightning. He had painted it a bright, gaudy crimson, which is a curious choice for a man whose job depends on stealth. It was the aerial equivalent of a professional gambler wearing a suit made entirely of flashing neon lights. He wanted his enemies to know exactly who was coming. He wanted them to see the red ghost in their rearview mirror and realize that their plans for dinner were suddenly very much in doubt. He led a squadron known as the Flying Circus, which sounded delightful and whimsical until you realized the clowns were armed with Spandau machine guns and the acrobats were doing loops specifically to get a better angle on your fuel tank. Richthofen was the ringmaster of this macabre performance, a man who treated air combat with the cold, calculated precision of a chess master. If chess involved falling 3 miles through the air in a flaming box of sticks. The rules of the hunt. The Baron was not a reckless man. He didn't believe in stunts or gallantry in the way the romantic poets did. He had a set of rules, a dicta belca, which he followed with the devotion of a monk. Never fly alone. Always have the sun at your back. Never pursue an enemy too far into his own territory. He knew that the sky was a place of mathematical certainty. If you were at X altitude and the enemy was at Y, and you had a certain degree of velocity, the outcome was as predictable as a tax bill. He was a creature of ballistics, a man who understood that a bullet doesn't care about your title, your noble birth, or the fact that you have a very handsome mustache. A bullet is a very simple-minded object. It only wants to go from point A to point B as quickly as possible. And if you happen to be point B, that is purely your own misfortune. But the trouble with being a legend is that you eventually start to believe the stories told about you. You begin to think that the laws of physics are merely suggestions, and that the earth has a certain respect for your reputation. On the 21st of April, 1918, Manfred von Richthofen forgot his own rules. The last dance over the Somme. The day was clear, the sort of morning that makes a man feel as though he might live forever, which is always a dangerous sentiment during a world war. The Baron was leading his circus over the Somme River when they encountered a group of Sopwith camels, British planes that were notorious for being difficult to fly and even more difficult to shoot down. In the ensuing dogfight, a term that suggests a level of dignity and grace that is entirely absent when 12 men are trying to turn each other into Swiss cheese, Richthofen spotted a young Canadian pilot named Wilfred Whop May. Now, May was a novice, which in 1918 was another word for target. His guns had jammed, and he was doing the only sensible thing a man in a jammed airplane can do. He was running for home as fast as his little engine could carry him. The Baron saw the easy prey. He saw the opportunity for victory number 81. He forgot about the sun. He forgot about the wind. He even forgot about the Allied lines. He dove after May, staying low, dangerously low, skimming over the rooftops and the trenches of the Australian infantry. He was so focused on the bird in his sights that he failed to notice the hunters on the ground. The Great Australian Accidental. Now, a machine gunner in a muddy trench does not care for the chivalry of the air. He does not care about aces or knights of the blue. He only knows that a very bright red airplane is flying past him at eye level, and it is making a tremendous amount of noise. An Australian gunner named Cedric Popkin, a name that sounds like a character from a children's book, but who was, in fact, a very serious man with a Vickers gun, saw the red blur. He didn't wait for a formal introduction. He simply pointed his weapon and pulled the trigger, sending a stream of lead into the path of the legend. At the same time, a Canadian pilot named Roy Brown was diving from above, firing his own guns in a desperate attempt to save his comrade. The red triplane wobbled. It didn't explode in a fireball. It didn't do a dramatic death spiral. It simply lost its grace. The Baron, the man who had mastered the 3 dimensions of the sky, was suddenly being reclaimed by the oldest and most stubborn dimension of all, the Earth. He managed to land the plane in a beet field, which is a very unromantic place to end a legendary career. By the time the Australian soldiers reached him, the Red Baron was gone. He had been hit by a single bullet that had passed through his chest, a piece of lead no bigger than a man's thumb that had proven once and for all that even the most famous predator in the world is still just a collection of fragile plumbing and vulnerable aspirations. The chivalry of the grave. The death of the Red Baron caused a sensation that is hard to imagine in our cynical age. To the Allies, it was as if a dragon had been slain. To the Germans, it was a blow to the national soul. But what happened next was the most whimsical part of the whole tragedy. Because the Baron had been a knight, the Allied pilots decided he deserved a funeral befitting his status. They didn't toss him in a ditch or put his plane in a museum. They gave him a full military burial with all the trimmings. 6 Allied squadrons sent representatives. They fired a salute. They laid wreaths. They even dropped a photograph of the funeral over the German lines with a note that said, "To the German Flying Corps. He was a brave man and a clean fighter. We are sorry he is dead." It is a peculiar thing about the human race, I have often noted, that we will spend years trying to kill a man with the utmost enthusiasm, and then, once we have succeeded, we will spend a fortune on flowers to apologize for the inconvenience. The legend and the law. The sky was quieter after that. The Red Baron became a ghost, a brand of frozen pizza, and the nemesis of a cartoon beagle. But in April of 1918, he was the symbol of an era that was dying. The nightly air war was being replaced by the grim mechanical reality of the industrial age. The Baron had been brought down not by a more talented hero, but by the sheer, messy probability of the battlefield. He had succumbed to the law of ballistics, which states that if you fly in front of enough bullets for long enough, one of them will eventually take a liking to you. He had forgotten that the sky is not a kingdom. It is a laboratory where gravity always gets the last word. As the Red Baron was laid to rest in the French soil, the war continued its inexorable crawl toward the 11th hour. The air was still full of planes, but the circus had lost its ringmaster. And on the ground, far below the clouds where the Baron had played his lethal games, a different kind of darkness was falling over the east. A cellar in Yekaterinburg, where a 300-year-old dynasty was about to find out that history, like gravity, has a very heavy hand. Chapter 7. The Cellar in Yekaterinburg. History, in its infinite capacity for irony, often treats the fall of an empire with all the dignity of a man slipping on a banana peel in the middle of a funeral procession. We like to imagine that when a 300-year-old dynasty collapses, it should do so with a thunderclap that rattles the teeth of the gods, or perhaps a grand operatic finale involving a Viking funeral and a choir of angels. But in July of 1918, the Romanov dynasty, the grand, gilded, and hopelessly confused rulers of all the Russias, came to an end in a damp basement in a mining town where the most interesting thing to do was watch the moss grow. The Romanovs had spent 3 centuries operating on the principle of divine right. which is a very comfortable political theory that suggests God himself has a personal interest in which particular person wears the biggest hat in Moscow. It is a wonderful arrangement for the man in the hat, but it is a bit of a hard sell for the fellow at the bottom of the pile who is currently eating soup made of dirt and desperation. By 1918, the Russian people had decided they were through with hats. They had replaced the Tsar with a group of gentlemen called the Bolsheviks, who believed that the only thing better than a king's whim was a committee's decree. They were led by a man named Lenin, who possessed a very sharp beard and a set of ideas that made a librarian's filing system look like a riot at a carnival. The Tsar of small things. Nicholas II, the last of the Tsars, was a man who was profoundly unqualified for the job of being a legend. He was, by all accounts, a very nice fellow. He liked to take photographs of his children, he enjoyed a brisk walk in the garden, and he was remarkably good at being polite to people he didn't like. If he had been born as a country squire in Sussex, he would have lived a long, happy life, and been remembered fondly for his excellent collection of hydrangeas. Unfortunately for Nicholas, he was born as the absolute ruler of a country that spanned 11 time zones and was currently on fire. He had a wife, Alexandra, who was a woman of deep convictions and even deeper superstitions. She was particularly fond of a wandering mystic named Rasputin, a man who possessed the grooming habits of a mountain goat and the charisma of a runaway train. Alexandra believed that if Rasputin was happy, the empire was safe. This was a theory that the Russian people found increasingly difficult to swallow, particularly when they were freezing to death in the trenches of the Great War. By the spring of 1918, the entire family, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 beautiful daughters, and their young son, Alexei, had been shuttled about the country like a set of very expensive luggage that nobody quite knew where to check in. They eventually landed in a place called Yekaterinburg, in a building the Bolsheviks had ominously renamed the House of Special Purpose. Whenever a government gives a building a name like the House of Special Purpose, I've often remarked, you can be reasonably certain that the purpose in question is not a surprise birthday party. The House of Special Purpose. The Apatiev house was a sturdy 2-story merchant's home that had been turned into a fortress. The windows were painted white so the family couldn't see out, and a high wooden fence was built around the perimeter so the world couldn't see in. The Romanovs were living in a state of monastic simplicity, which is a polite way of saying they were prisoners of a group of guards who didn't much care for the divine nature of their guests. The family spent their days playing cards, reading the Bible, and trying to pretend that they weren't the center of a global political storm. Nicholas chopped wood in the courtyard, an activity he found much more rewarding than governing, as the wood generally did what it was told. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks were in a bit of a pickle. A white army of royalists was approaching Yekaterinburg, and the local commissars were worried that if the Tsar were rescued, he might become a rallying point for the counter-revolution. They decided that the special purpose of the house needed to be fulfilled, and they needed to do it with the efficiency of a bureaucrat and the coldness of a Siberian winter. The night of the basement. In the early hours of July 17th, the family was woken up and told that they were being moved for their own safety. They were led down a dark flight of stairs into a small semi-basement room. Nicholas, ever the gentleman, asked for 2 chairs, one for his wife and one for his ailing son. The guards obliged, showing a final fleeting spark of human decency before the darkness closed in. They stood there, a king, a queen, 5 children, a doctor, and 3 servants, waiting for a truck to arrive, or so they were told. Instead, a man named Yurovsky entered the room with a squad of armed men and read a short clipped decree that sounded more like a grocery list than a death warrant. What followed was a flurry of lead, smoke, and total confusion. And here, history takes a turn into the truly bizarre. You see, the Romanov daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, had been raised in a world where wealth was their only defense. Before they left the palace, they had sewn the family's vast collection of diamonds, pearls, and precious stones into their corsets and undergarments. They were, quite literally, wearing a fortune in body armor. When the shooting began, the bullets ricocheted off the hidden jewels, zipping around the room like angry hornets. It was a scene of terrifying absurdity. The very wealth that had once elevated them above the common man was now, in a cruel twist of fate, prolonging their agony. The old world was trying to protect itself with its own treasure, but against the iron resolve of the new world, diamonds were merely an inconvenience. The silence of the century. By the time the smoke cleared, the Romanov dynasty was no more. 300 years of pomp, circumstance, and divine right had vanished in 20 minutes. The bodies were taken to a forest, burned, and buried in a mine shaft, as if by hiding the evidence, the Bolsheviks could delete the past from the hard drive of human memory. But you cannot delete a king. You can only turn him into a ghost. The Red Terror had begun in earnest. The Bolsheviks realized that if they could execute a czar and his family, they could do anything. The law was no longer a thing of precedents and judges. It was a thing of revolutionary conscience, which is a very convenient phrase that allows a man to do whatever he pleases as long as he says he's doing it for the people. The people, I have noted, is a remarkably patient entity that is frequently used as an excuse by men who have no intention of ever meeting one of them in person. The fall of the Romanovs was the definitive end of the 19th century, the age of the benevolent or not-so-benevolent despot was being replaced by the age of the ideological machine. The world had moved from the whim of a man in a crown to the logic of a man in a leather coat. The ghost of Anastasia. For decades afterward, rumors persisted that one of the daughters, usually Anastasia, had survived the cellar. Dozens of women appeared in Berlin, Paris, and New York, claiming to be the lost Grand Duchess. They told stories of secret rescues, kind-hearted guards, and miraculous escapes. It was a beautiful story, and the world wanted to believe it. We wanted to believe that somewhere the fairy tale hadn't ended in a blood-stained basement. We wanted to believe that a diamond corset really could stop the march of time. But in the end, the science of the 20th century caught up with the myths of the 19th. DNA testing, a thing that would have sounded like witchcraft to Nicholas II, confirmed that the entire family had perished together in Yekaterinburg. The Romanovs were gone, and Russia was now the Soviet Union, a vast gray laboratory where a new kind of human being was being engineered. The Red Terror wasn't just a rumor, it was the new government policy. The basement in Yekaterinburg was the foundation of a new empire, one that would trade the divine right of kings for the historic necessity of the state. And as the sun rose over the Ural Mountains on that July morning, the world realized that the old maps were useless. The borders of empires were being redrawn in blood, and the Great War was no longer just a struggle between nations. It was a struggle between the past and a future that looked increasingly cold, increasingly silent, and increasingly certain. Chapter 8. The Lost Battalion. If there is one thing I have learned from my time on the Mississippi, it is that a man can be perfectly well aware of his location and still be entirely lost to the rest of the world. A steamboat pilot might know exactly which sandbar he is currently perched upon, but if the rest of the river has decided to move 3 miles to the left without notifying him, he is, for all practical purposes, a castaway. In October of 1918, a gentleman named Charles Whittlesey found himself in a similar predicament, though instead of a sandbar, he was perched in a ravine in the Argonne forest. Now, the Argonne is not the kind of forest where one goes for a Sunday stroll to admire the ferns. It is a tangled, vertical, and thoroughly ill-tempered thicket of brambles and ancient trees that seem to have been grown for the express purpose of snagging a man's tunic and stealing his dignity. It is a place where geography goes to die, and where a compass is about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Whittlesey was, by trade, a Wall Street lawyer. He was a man accustomed to the orderly world of contracts, depositions, and the quiet rustle of mahogany-paneled offices. He was tall, thin, and wore spectacles that gave him the air of a man who was perpetually about to ask you to cite your sources. But by the grace of the United States Army, this man of the law had been placed in command of nearly 700 men and told to march into the heart of the Argonne to break the German line. The perils of following orders. The trouble with being a lawyer in a war is that you have a tendency to take instructions literally. The order given to Whittlesey and his men was simple: advance regardless of cost, and do not retreat. Now, most experienced soldiers understand that an order like that is usually intended as a general suggestion, a sort of do your best, but try not to get everyone killed. But Whittlesey, with the ironclad logic of a man who has read the fine print, took it as a binding contract. He led his men, a motley collection of New York street toughs, Irish immigrants, and wide-eyed farm boys, up a steep ridge and into a pocket of the forest. They fought like demons. They scrambled over the limestone and through the barbed wire, and by nightfall they had reached their objective. They dug in, patted themselves on the back, and waited for the units on their left and right to catch up. The units on their left and right, however, had encountered the German army in a particularly foul mood and had decided that advancing regardless of cost was an expensive hobby they weren't interested in pursuing. They had stayed put or retreated, leaving Whittlesey and his men sitting all alone in a ravine, surrounded on 4 sides by Germans who were quite surprised to find a group of Americans sitting in their backyard. They weren't lost in the sense that they didn't know where they were. They knew exactly where they were. They were in a hole, surrounded by people who wanted to kill them. It was the rest of the American army that was lost to them. The politeness of the grave. The Germans, being a methodical people, realized that they had a golden opportunity. They had surrounded over 500 Americans, The numbers had already begun to dwindle, and they had them pinned down with machine guns and mortars. They assumed, quite naturally, that any sensible group of human beings in such a position would see the logic of the situation and surrender. They even sent a polite note. I have always admired the Germans for their paperwork. In the middle of a deluge of lead and iron, a German officer took the time to type out a very civil letter on a real typewriter. It was addressed to the commander of the 2nd Battalion, 308th Infantry, and it spoke of the sufferings of your wounded and the uselessness of further resistance. It was a masterpiece of tact, essentially saying, "Dear sir, you are currently in a very inconvenient spot, and we would be much obliged if you would stop being so difficult and come over here so we can put you in a cage." Whittlesey read the note. He did not call a committee meeting. He did not consult his law books. According to legend, and I have never met a legend I didn't like, he didn't even bother to reply in writing. He simply took the white flags the Germans had provided for the surrender and ordered them to be pulled down and hidden, lest anyone get the wrong idea. There is no man quite so stubborn, as I have observed, as a New York lawyer who believes he has been given a raw deal. You can take his food, you can take his sleep, and you can even take his spectacles. But if you try to take his pride, he will bite your hand off just to prove a point. The heroism of a pigeon. For 5 days, the lost battalion lived on prayers, iron rations, and the occasional canteen of muddy water. They were being hit by German grenades from above, and, in a truly tragic twist of administrative bungling, by their own American artillery from behind. The folks in the rear knew there were Germans in that ravine, and they didn't realize their own boys were sitting right in the middle of the target. Whittlesey had one way to communicate: carrier pigeons. He started with 7. One by one, they were released into the smoky air, and one by one, they were shot down by German marksmen who viewed a pigeon as a very small, very delicious message carrier. Finally, there was only one bird left, a small gray and white pigeon named Cher Ami. Now, a pigeon is not a creature of high intellect. It does not have a grasp of the 14 points or the geopolitical significance of the Argonne Forest. It only knows that it wants to go home, because that is where the good seeds are. Whittlesey tied a desperate note to Cher Ami's leg. "Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." Cher Ami took off. The Germans opened fire with everything they had. The bird was hit in the breast, she lost an eye, and one of her legs was hanging by a mere tendon. She fell out of the sky like a stone. The men in the ravine watched her fall and felt their last spark of hope flicker out. But then the most remarkable thing happened. Cher Ami, possessed of a stubbornness that would have made a Missouri mule look like a pushover, shook herself, flapped her wings, and took to the sky again. She flew 25 miles in 25 minutes, landing at the division headquarters bleeding and battered, but with the note still clinging to her mangled leg. The artillery stopped. The message had been delivered. The victory of the unyielding. The lost battalion was eventually rescued. Of the nearly 700 men who had marched into that ravine, only 194 walked out on their own 2 feet. They were ghosts, gaunt, bearded, and smelling of death, but they were still holding their rifles. They had proven that stubbornness is the most effective military strategy ever devised, You can have all the machine guns and mortars in the world, but if the fellow you are shooting at simply refuses to notice that he is supposed to be defeated, you are going to have a very long afternoon. Whittlesey was awarded the Medal of Honor, though he remained a man of quiet, somber disposition. I suspect that for the rest of his life, whenever he looked at a forest or a lawyer's brief, he saw that muddy ravine in France. As for Chère Amie, she was given a medal as well, the Croix de Guerre. The French doctors carved her a little wooden leg so she could stand up straight, and she was sent back to America as a hero. She lived out her days in luxury, presumably telling the other pigeons about the time she saved 500 New Yorkers while missing half her vital organs. The lesson of the Argonne. The story of the lost battalion reminds us that war is not a game of grand maneuvers and clever maps. It is a game of human endurance. It is about how much a man can stand before he breaks, and the surprising discovery that some men simply don't have a breaking point. The Argonne forest remained a dark, tangled mess, but it was no longer a German stronghold. The lost had been found. The devil dogs were still barking, and the Kaiser's navy was beginning to wonder if it might be safer to stay in the harbor than to face the rising tide of American gumption. But as the war in the trenches reached its final desperate stage, a different kind of mutiny was brewing in the North. A rebellion of sailors who had decided that the honorable thing to do was to stay alive, and that a suicide mission was a bit too much commitment for a Tuesday afternoon. Chapter 9. The Mutiny at Kiel. There is a peculiar variety of honor that exists only in the minds of men who wear a great deal of gold braid and who have never personally had to scrub a deck or dodge a piece of flying shrapnel. This brand of honor usually involves a firm insistence that someone else should die in a spectacular and entirely useless fashion, so that the fellow in the fancy hat can maintain a dignified expression at his next dinner party. By October of 1918, the German High Command was suffering from a terminal case of this gilded vanity. The war was lost. The German army was retreating with the grace of a man falling down a flight of stairs while holding a tray of crystal, and the American devil dogs were practically knocking on the front door. But the admirals of the high seas fleet, sitting in their well-heated offices in Wilhelmshaven, decided that the only way to end the war was with a death ride. They wanted the entire German Navy to sail out and pick a fight with the British Royal Navy, a force that was currently about 3 times their size and possessed of a very long memory regarding past grievances. It was to be a glorious suicide mission, a final bloody salute to a fading empire. The admirals called it an honorable conclusion. The sailors, who were the ones expected to do the bleeding, had a different name for it. They called it being murdered by an idiot. The view from the boiler room. Now, a sailor is a pragmatic creature. He spends his life in intimate contact with the laws of buoyancy, and he understands that when a ship goes to the bottom of the ocean, the honor of the admiral does not function as a life jacket. For 4 years, these men had lived in a state of suspended animation, bottled up in their harbors by the British blockade, eating soup that was increasingly composed of sawdust, water, and the occasional rumor of a potato. They had watched as the Russian sailors, those fellows we discussed in the cellar of Yekaterinburg, had decided to trade their czars for a new set of ideas involving committees and red flags. The German sailors were starting to think that a committee sounded like a very fine thing indeed, especially if that committee's first order of business was to stop the ship from being blown into matchsticks for the sake of an admiral's reputation. When the order came on the 29th of October to prepare the fleet for a final sortie, the admirals expected cheers and a sudden outbreak of patriotic singing. Instead, they got silence. And then they got the most terrifying sound in the history of any military organization, the sound of several thousand men politely saying, "No." The silent boilers. The mutiny didn't begin with a grand speech or a dramatic duel. It began in the engine rooms, in the dark, sweltering bellies of the great battleships, monsters with names like the Thüringen and the Helgoland. The stokers simply stopped shoveling coal. Imagine, if you will, an admiral on the bridge, his telescope aimed toward the horizon, his heart full of Wagnerian drama, waiting for the great cloud of black smoke that signifies his fleet is ready for glory. He waits, he checks his watch, he adjusted his metals, and the smoke never comes. The boilers remain cold. The ships remain tethered to the earth by the simple refusal of a few hundred men to pick up a shovel. A man can be an emperor, a king, or an admiral of the fleet, I have observed, but his power ends precisely at the fingertips of the fellow who knows how to make the machine go. If the stoker decides he would rather have a sandwich than a sea burial, the emperor is just a gentleman in a very expensive suit, standing on a very large piece of floating scrap metal. The admirals were aghast. They tried to arrest the leaders. They sent in Marines. They threatened. They blustered. And they invoked the Kaiser's name with the frequency of a man trying to start a stubborn engine with a prayer. But the fire had spread. By the time the fleet reached the port of Kiel, the mutiny had transformed from a local labor dispute into a full-scale revolution. The red flag over the harbor. At Kiel, the sailors went ashore and found that the workers in the shipyards were just as tired of sawdust soup as they were. Within 48 hours, the city was under the control of a sailors' and workers' council. They seized the barracks, they opened the prisons, and in a move that must have caused 1,000 monocles to hit the floor simultaneously, they hauled down the imperial flag and replaced it with a plain red banner. The German government, which was currently trying to negotiate a peace treaty with Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points, suddenly realized that they were trying to sell a house while the kitchen was being dismantled by the staff. They sent a politician named Noske to Kiel to try and calm the waters. Noske arrived expecting to find a disorganized mob that could be easily managed with a few firm words and a promise of an extra potato. Instead, he found 20,000 armed sailors who had discovered that liberty was even more intoxicating than the local schnapps. They didn't want a speech. They wanted the war to stop. They wanted the Kaiser to go, and they wanted a future that didn't involve sinking into the North Sea in October. The crumbling engine room of empire. The mutiny at Kiel was the first crack in the dam, and once the water started moving, there was no stopping it. The news spread like a fever. Sailors from Kiel took the trains they had commandeered themselves, and traveled to Hamburg, to Bremen, to Hanover, and finally to Berlin. At every stop, they told the same story. We have stopped the war. The fleet has said no. Why are you still saying yes? The German Empire was like a grand, ornate clock that had been ticking for centuries, but whose internal gears had finally ground themselves into dust. The Kaiser Wilhelm II was currently at his military headquarters in Spa, Belgium, moving imaginary armies around on a map and wondering why his telegrams were increasingly going unanswered. He didn't realize that his divine right was currently being debated by a group of sailors in a smoky hall in Kiel, and that the sailors were winning the argument. He believed that his people loved him. He believed that his army would protect him. He failed to grasp that an army and a navy are not made of tin soldiers, but of human beings who have a startlingly high interest in staying alive and whose families are currently starving at home. The irony of the anchor. There is a profound irony in the fact that the German Empire, which had spent millions of marks and decades of effort building a world-class navy to challenge the British, was eventually brought down by that very same navy. The ships that were supposed to be the symbols of German strength became the cradles of German revolution. The anchors that were meant to hold the fleet in the harbor ended up anchoring the end of the monarchy. The death ride never happened. The British Royal Navy sat in Scapa Flow, wondering why the Germans hadn't shown up for the final showdown, unaware that the German sailors had decided to conduct their own Battle of Jutland against their own officers. The mutiny at Kiel was the beginning of the end. It was the moment when the 11th hour began to chime in the distance. The war wasn't ending because of a clever maneuver or a brilliant treaty. It was ending because the people who did the work had decided they were through. The German Republic was about to be born in a state of total panic, and the Kaiser was about to find out that his fancy helmet didn't count for much when nobody was left to polish it. The moral of the shovel. History is often written as if it were a game of chess played by geniuses, but more often than not, it is determined by the man who refuses to move his pawn. The sailors at Kiel didn't have a grand philosophical blueprint for a new world. They just knew that a suicide mission was a poor way to spend a Tuesday. By saying no to a pointless death, they accidentally said yes to a new world. A world that was messy, uncertain, and full of names most people couldn't spell. But a world that was, at the very least, not currently on fire. The Great War was running out of steam, and it was the stokers of Kiel who had turned off the valves. As the red flags fluttered over the gray ships in the harbor, the rest of the world began to realize that the silence from the German Navy was louder than any cannon blast. The guns were still firing in the Argonne, and the Spanish lady was still sneezing in the cities, but the heart of the German Empire had stopped beating in the engine rooms of Kiel. Chapter 10. The Armistice in the Forest. If you were a deity looking for a place to put a period at the end of a particularly long and bloody sentence, you might choose a mountaintop, or perhaps a grand cathedral with echoing halls and a great deal of stained glass to catch the light of a new era. But man, in his infinite capacity for the understated and the inconvenient, decided that the Great War should come to its conclusion in a railway carriage parked in the middle of a damp, foggy thicket of trees known as the Forest of Compiègne. Now, there is something inherently French about conducting a surrender in a dining car. It suggests that while the world may be ending, there is no reason we cannot have a crisp linen tablecloth and perhaps a nice bottle of Bordeaux nearby, should the negotiation become particularly parched. The carriage in question belonged to Marshal Ferdinand Foch, a man whose mustache was so vast and authoritative it likely required its own passport to cross international borders. Foch was a soldier of the old school, which is to say, he believed that a victory wasn't official until the other fellow had been made to feel as small as a postage stamp in a hurricane. The arrival of the unfortunate. On the morning of the 8th of November, a small party of Germans arrived at the railway siding. They had been traveling for days, through the wreckage of their own retreating army and the smoldering ruins of a landscape they had once hoped to own. They were led by a man named Matthias Erzberger. Now, I have always felt a certain twinge of sympathy for Mr. Erzberger. He was not a general. He was a civilian politician, a man of the center who had spent his life worrying about budgets and committee reports. The German military elite, possessing the peculiar cowardice of men who are very brave with other people's lives, had decided that they didn't want their own fancy signatures on the document of defeat. They sent Erzberger, a man who looked like he should be managing a small-town apothecary, to tell the most powerful generals in the world that the German Empire had run out of steam, shoes, and patience. It is a time-honored tradition among the great powers, I have noted, to let the accountant deliver the news that the bank has been looted. It spares the bank robber the embarrassment of having to explain where the money went. They climbed into Foch's carriage, Wagon Litz 2419D, a place meant for sleeping and eating, now repurposed for the heavy business of humble pie. Foch looked at them with the cold, unblinking eyes of a hawk that has just spotted a particularly slow-moving mouse. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer a chair. He simply asked, "What do you want?" Erzberger, whose voice was likely trembling like a leaf in a Missouri gale, replied that they had come to hear the Allied proposals for an armistice. Foch, enjoying the moment with a cruelty that only a victor can truly savor, replied that he had no proposals. "I have no proposals to make," he said, effectively telling the Germans that if they wanted to stop being shot at, they would have to do the asking. The terms of the muzzle. The document Foch eventually produced was not a peace treaty. It was a list of requirements that would have made a landlord in a Dickens novel seem generous. Germany was to evacuate all occupied territories in 15 days. They were to surrender 5,000 cannons, 30,000 machine guns, and 2,000 airplanes. They were to hand over 5,000 locomotives and 150,000 railway cars, presumably so the French could carry all the other surrendered items back to Paris. But the most galling requirement was the surrender of the fleet, the same fleet that had recently decided that shoveling coal was a hobby they no longer wished to pursue. The Germans were told that their great battleships were to be handed over to the British and interned in a cold gray harbor in Scotland called Scapa Flow. Erzberger tried to protest. He pointed out that Germany was starving because of the Allied blockade. He argued that if they took away all the trains, the people wouldn't have any food. Foch simply looked at his watch. He gave them 72 hours to sign, or the guns would continue their monotonous dialogue. The 11th hour of the 11th day. For 3 days, the telegrams flew back and forth between the forest and the frantic government in Berlin. The Kaiser had abdicated, a subject we shall examine shortly. The Navy was in revolt, and the army was melting away like snow in a spring rain. On the morning of the 11th of November, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the ink was finally applied to the paper. But here history decided to indulge in a bit of theatricality. The armistice was signed at 5 a.m., but it was decided that the shooting should stop 6 hours later at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month. Now, to a man sitting in a comfortable office in London or Washington, this symmetry of numbers seems very poetic and satisfying. It has a ring to it. It looks good on a commemorative coin. But to the man sitting in a muddy hole in the Argonne forest with a rifle in his hand, those 6 hours were a very long time indeed. Imagine the absurdity of it. The war was over. The papers were signed. The generals were probably already thinking about what they would wear to the victory parade. And yet, for 6 more hours, the two greatest killing machines in human history continued to grind away at each other. Artillery shells were fired simply because they had already been loaded into the guns. Snipers took aim because it was their job to take aim until the clock struck 12. There were men who died at 10:59 a.m. on November 11th, men who were killed by a war that had technically ended 3 days prior, but which was waiting for a convenient number on the calendar to take its final bow. It was the ultimate triumph of the bureaucracy over the biology. The silence. And then it happened. At precisely 11 o'clock, the guns went silent. It wasn't a gradual fade-out. It wasn't a lingering echo. It was a sudden, violent, and utterly terrifying absence of noise. For 4 years, the world had been defined by sound, the whistle of the shell, the chatter of the machine gun, the scream of the engine, and the constant thumping heartbeat of the heavy artillery. The soldiers had become so accustomed to the roar that it had become their silence. When the shooting stopped, the silence was so loud it made their ears ring. It was a silence that carried the weight of 10 million ghosts. Men stood up in their trenches, tentatively at first, like creatures emerging from a cave after a long winter, and looked across no man's land. They saw the enemy doing the same thing. They saw that the Huns and the Tommies and the Sammies were all just a collection of tired, dirty, and remarkably hungry young men who were equally bewildered by the fact that they weren't being shot at. In some places they walked out and shook hands. In others, they simply sat down on the edge of their trenches and cried. The silence of a battlefield, I have observed, is the only sound in the world that can actually tell the truth. It tells you that the argument is over and that neither side was particularly right to begin with. The ringing in the ears. The armistice was not a peace. It was a ceasefire that was intended to last for 36 days. But everyone knew the war was over. The great machine had run out of fuel. Back in London, the bells of St. Paul's began to peal. In Paris, the crowds flooded the Champs-Élysées until the street looked like a river of tricolors. In New York, they threw so much ticker tape out of the windows that it looked like a blizzard had hit the city in the middle of a heat wave. The world was drunk on the sheer impossible fact of peace. But in the forest of Compiègne, the fog remained. The railway carriage sat on its siding, a silent witness to the end of the old world. Marshal Foch had achieved his victory, and Matthias Erzberger had achieved his tragedy. The Great War was finished, leaving behind a generation that was lost, a continent that was bankrupt, and a map that looked like a jigsaw puzzle that had been sat upon by an elephant. The guns had been told to be quiet, and for a few years they would listen. But as the soldiers began the long, weary trek back to homes that no longer looked the same, they carried the silence of the forest with them. It was a silence that rang in their ears, a reminder that the world had survived its first major surgery, but that the doctor had forgotten to sew up the wounds. The 11th hour had struck. The Kaiser was looking for his luggage, and the map makers were sharpening their pencils, preparing to draw lines across the ruins of empires. The war was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. Chapter 11. The Kaiser's One-Way Ticket. There is nothing quite so fragile as a crown that has been polished until the gold is worn thin, and there is no man quite so lonely as a monarch who has suddenly discovered that his divine right to rule does not include the right to a seat on the train home. For 30 years, Kaiser Wilhelm II had operated on the assumption that the Almighty spent a significant portion of his time personally reviewing the German imperial wardrobe and ensuring that the Kaiser's various helmets, most of which featured a spike sharp enough to serve as a lightning rod, were always shimmering with the appropriate level of Teutonic majesty. Wilhelm was a man who viewed life as a grand theatrical production in which he was the director, the lead actor, the costume designer, and the fellow who sold the tickets at the door. He possessed more uniforms than there are days in a leap year, ranging from Admiral of the Atlantic, a title he gave himself, despite the Atlantic never having been consulted on the matter, to Honorary Colonel of the British Hussars. He was a man who could not walk past a mirror without stopping to give it a sharp military salute, presumably to thank it for providing such a handsome view. But by November of 1918, the theater was on fire. The audience was throwing radishes at the stage, and the stagehands, the sailors at Kiel, and the soldiers in the trenches had decided to go on strike and join the audience in the radish throwing. The unpleasantry at Spa. The end of the German Empire did not happen in a throne room in Berlin. It happened in a hotel in the Belgian town of Spa. Now, Spa is a place where people usually go to drink sulphurous water and discuss their liver ailments in hushed tones. It was here that Wilhelm had established his military headquarters, far enough from the front to avoid the unpleasantness of the bullets, but close enough to feel like he was participating in the general mayhem. On the 9th of November, Wilhelm sat in his office and waited for his generals to tell him that the revolution in Berlin was merely a misunderstanding, perhaps a particularly boisterous celebration of his latest uniform. Instead, he was met by General Wilhelm Groener. Groener was a man of the new school, which is to say, he was a man who understood that a bayonet is only useful if there is a man willing to hold the other end of it. Wilhelm, clutching his sword hilt, suggested that he might lead his army back to Berlin to crush the socialist rabble. Groener looked at the Kaiser with the weary patience of a school teacher explaining a simple arithmetic problem to a particularly dim-witted child. "Sire," Groener said, with the clinical coldness of a man delivering a death warrant, "the army will march home in peace and order under its leaders and generals, but not under the command of your Majesty, for it no longer stands behind your Majesty." It was the ultimate Dear John letter of history. The Kaiser had been dumped by his own infantry. He had spent his life playing soldier only to find out that when the real soldiers decided to go home, they hadn't bothered to leave him a map. The ghosting of a monarch. While Wilhelm was still trying to digest the fact that he was now the only man in Spa who thought he was in charge, the situation in Berlin took a turn for the absurd. The Chancellor, Prince Max of Baden, a man whose primary qualification for the job was a desire to be anywhere else, realized that if the Kaiser didn't abdicate immediately, the city would be torn apart by the mob. So, Prince Max did something that would have made a modern politician proud. He simply lied. He issued a press release stating that the Kaiser had abdicated despite the fact that Wilhelm was currently in Spa, still wearing his favorite helmet and insisting that everything was under control. Imagine, if you will, the Kaiser picking up the morning paper and discovering that he had resigned from his job without having been consulted. It was the first instance of a head of state being fired via a news alert. Wilhelm was furious. He drafted a protest. He shouted at the curtains. He demanded a recount. But it didn't matter. Once the people of Berlin heard he was gone, they cheered so loud that the sound carried all the way to the Belgian border. The German Republic was declared from a balcony, and the Kaiser was left standing in a hotel lobby with a very large collection of fancy luggage and no country to put it in. The midnight dash for the border. By the early hours of November 10th, it became clear that if Wilhelm stayed in Spa, he would likely be handed over to the revolutionaries or, even worse, to the British, who had a very high interest in seeing him dangling from a lamppost. The decision was made to flee to the Netherlands, a country that was neutral nearby and possessed of a queen who was a distant cousin of Wilhelm's, and therefore might be expected to provide a spare bedroom. The Kaiser train, a palace on wheels featuring gold leaf moldings and a kitchen that could produce a 10-course meal while traveling at 60 miles an hour, was readied. But at the last moment, they decided the train was too conspicuous. You cannot sneak out of a revolution in a gold-plated locomotive. So, the Kaiser, the man who had dreamed of world conquest, was packed into a gray Mercedes-Benz and driven toward the Dutch border like a nervous tourist who has forgotten his passport. At the border crossing of Eyston, the Dutch guards were surprised to see a convoy of luxury cars arriving at dawn. A bearded man in a general's uniform stepped out and identified himself as the Emperor of Germany. The guards, who were used to checking crates of cabbages and the occasional wandering cow, were understandably confused. They told the Emperor of Germany to wait in the station office while they telephoned the government in The Hague to see if he was allowed in. There is no level of human dignity, I have often noted, that cannot be undermined by the requirement to wait in a drafty railway station while a man in a rumpled uniform tries to find a telephone that works. Wilhelm spent 6 hours pacing the platform at Eyston. He drank lukewarm coffee. He looked at the rain. He watched the Dutch peasants go about their business, none of whom seemed particularly impressed by his withered arm or his imperial pedigree. He was no longer a warlord. He was an internee. The asylum at Amerungen. Eventually, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands gave her grudging consent. Wilhelm was shuffled off to Amerungen Castle, the home of Count Godard von Bentinck. The Count was a hospitable man, but he was also a man who appreciated his privacy, and suddenly finding himself the host of a deposed emperor and his entire entourage of weeping adjutants must have been a trial for even the most patient of noblemen. Wilhelm arrived at the castle, walked up the stairs, and reportedly said, "Now, give me a cup of tea, hot English tea, and we shall see." It was his way of trying to reclaim a bit of the domestic normalcy he had spent 30 years trying to destroy. The Allies, led by David Lloyd George, shouted for the trial of the Kaiser. They wanted to bring him to London and hang him for the crime of starting the war. But the Dutch, with a stubbornness that I have always admired, refused to hand him over. They argued that asylum was a sacred right, even for men who had a distressing habit of invading their neighbors. And so the Kaiser stayed. He lived in the Netherlands for the next 22 years, eventually buying a house called Huis Doorn. He became a man of leisure, though he never quite gave up the hope that the German people would realize their mistake and send a golden carriage to bring him home. They never did. The moral of the spiked helmet. Wilhelm's primary occupation in exile was the chopping of wood. He spent hours every day in the forest, armed with an axe and a saw, methodically reducing the Dutch woodlands to a collection of neat, orderly piles of firewood. One cannot help but see the poetic justice in this. The man who had spent his life trying to fell the great empires of the world was now reduced to felling oak trees in a quiet garden. He chopped down over 40,000 trees during his exile. It was as if he were trying to prune the world back into a shape he could understand, one log at a time. He also spent a great deal of time wondering where his fancy helmets had gone. In the rush to flee Germany, much of the imperial regalia had been lost, stolen, or put into museums to be gawked at by people who didn't know a pickelhaube from a soup tureen. The divine right had been replaced by the right to a quiet retirement. The Kaiser's flight was the final, undignified wheeze of the old world. The age of the absolute monarch, the man who could declare war because his breakfast had been cold or because his cousin's yacht was larger than his own, was over. The world was now in the hands of the common man, which sounds like a very fine thing until you realize that the common man is just as capable of making a mess of things as a Kaiser. He just does it with less gold braid. Wilhelm II died in 1941, still in the Netherlands, still chopping wood, and still convinced that if he had just worn a slightly more impressive uniform at the right moment, everything would have turned out differently. He was a man who had been outpaced by his own century, a ghost from a Victorian play who had accidentally wandered onto the set of a modern tragedy. The German Republic was born in a state of total panic, and the map-makers were already busy in Paris, carving up the world into new and interesting shapes. The Kaiser had his one-way ticket, and the rest of the world was left with the bill for the journey. Chapter 12. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the new map. If you have ever attempted to dismantle a piece of heavy, ornate Victorian furniture, one of those mahogany monstrosities with more claw feet than a centipede and enough velvet padding to muffle a thunderclap, you will understand the state of Europe in the late autumn of 1918. For centuries, the continent had been dominated by 3 or 4 great imperial wardrobes: the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. These were solid, dependable things that looked as though they had been bolted to the floor of history by the Almighty himself. But by the time the guns fell silent in November, someone had taken a metaphorical sledgehammer to the parlor. The empires hadn't just collapsed. They had disintegrated into a billion splinters, leaving a collection of confused diplomats in Paris with the unenviable task of trying to glue the mess back together into something that wouldn't immediately tip over and crush the neighbors. The result was the successor states, a dozen or so brand new countries that appeared on the map like mushrooms after a particularly radioactive rainstorm. These were nations with names that the average American congressman couldn't pronounce without the aid of a local guide and a glass of water. and borders that seemed to have been drawn by a man who had been blindfolded, spun around 3 times, and handed a very sharp pair of scissors. The resurrection of Poland. The most spectacular piece of magic in this geographical circus was the sudden reappearance of Poland. Now, Poland is a country that possesses the peculiar historical habit of being a nation one minute and a province of someone else the next. For over 100 years, Poland had been partitioned, which is a polite diplomatic term for being chopped into 3 pieces and swallowed by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Poland didn't exist on the map. It only existed in the hearts of Polish people and in the particularly stubborn dreams of certain poets. But in 1918, thanks to Woodrow Wilson's 13th point, which was much luckier than the number would suggest, Poland was brought back to life. It was as if a man had died in 1815, been buried, and then suddenly sat up at his own funeral and asked where the nearest seaport was. The trouble was, nobody could quite agree on where Poland started and where the other fellows ended. To give the new nation a corridor to the Baltic Sea, the map-makers decided to slice a piece out of Germany, effectively turning East Prussia into a geographical island. This was known as the Polish Corridor, and it was about as popular with the Germans as a case of the mumps at a wedding. There is no more certain way to ensure a future argument, I have observed, than to draw a line through a man's backyard and tell him that his vegetable garden now belongs to a fellow he hasn't spoken to in a century. The shotgun wedding of Czechoslovakia. Then there was Czechoslovakia. This was a country that had been invented almost entirely on paper by a gentleman named Tomáš Masaryk and a group of enthusiasts who met in, of all places, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was a hyphenated nation, a union of the Czechs, who were industrial, sophisticated, and fond of beer, and the Slovaks, who were agricultural, traditional, and also fond of beer, though perhaps a different brand. The logic was that together they would be strong enough to resist the Germans and the Hungarians. It was a lovely theory, but it ignored the fact that the two groups had about as much in common as a river pilot and a desert camel. They were joined together in a sort of shotgun wedding of nations, with the Allies acting as the nervous father-in-law holding the weapon. To make matters even more interesting, the new borders of Czechoslovakia included a fringe of land called the Sudetenland, which was populated by 3 million Germans who were suddenly told they were no longer part of an empire, but citizens of a brand new republic they hadn't asked for. It was a recipe for a headache that would eventually grow into a migraine that would bother the world for the next 20 years. The Grand Muddle of the Balkans. Further south, the map makers were busy creating Yugoslavia, which was originally called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. This was a name so long it required a very wide stamp just to put it on a postcard. The idea here was to take all the South Slavs who had been bickering under the thumb of the Austrians and the Ottomans and put them into one big happy family. The trouble is, if you take 5 people who have been trying to poke each other's eyes out for 500 years and lock them in a small room together, they do not necessarily become a happy family. They usually just find new and creative ways to continue the poking. Yugoslavia was a magnificent experiment in optimistic geography. It was a country with 3 religions, 2 alphabets, and a dozen languages, all held together by a king and a general sense of, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. It was a masterpiece of the cartographer's art and a nightmare for anyone who actually had to live there. The small change of the Baltics. And we mustn't forget the smaller change of the Great Dismantling. Up in the north, 3 tiny nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, shook themselves free of the collapsing Russian Empire and declared themselves open for business. They were like 3 small, neat houses that had suddenly been revealed after the giant mansion next door had burned to the ground. They were democratic, they were industrious, and they were desperately hoping that the giant who lived to the east wouldn't wake up from his Bolshevik nap and notice that they were there. The map makers of Paris. The men responsible for this global redecoration were currently gathering at the Paris Peace Conference. They were led by the Big Four: Wilson of America, Lloyd George of Britain, Clemenceau of France, and Orlando of Italy. These gentlemen sat in gilded rooms surrounded by mountains of maps, piles of statistics, and a constant stream of petitioners from every corner of the earth who were all convinced that their particular mountain range or goat pasture was the most important spot on the planet. The map makers had a set of tools that were remarkably ill-suited to the task. They had self-determination, which sounded noble but was impossible to apply when every village had 3 different ethnicities living in it. They had strategic necessity, which was a fancy way of saying, I want that coal mine. And they had historical rights, which meant we owned this place back when the Romans were in charge, so we should have it back now. They drew lines across mountains they had never climbed and through rivers they had never fished. They created free cities like Danzig, which was a city that belonged to nobody and therefore was a source of annoyance to everybody. They dismantled the Ottoman Empire like a Thanksgiving turkey, handing out pieces, Syria to the French, Palestine and Mesopotamia to the British, as if they were prizes at a county fair. The moral of the wet ink. The map of 1918 was a thing of beauty, clean, colorful, and entirely fictional. It represented the world as it ought to be, according to a group of well-meaning gentlemen in frock coats. But the ink was barely dry before the reality of human nature began to smudge the lines. Empires are easy to take apart, but nations are hard to build. You can draw a border on a map with a ruler and a steady hand, but you cannot draw a border through a man's memory or his grandmother's stories. The new map of 1918 was less a blueprint for peace and more a catalogue of future grievances. Geography, I have often mused, is a subject that is best left to the rocks and the trees. When men get involved with it, they usually end up using the map as a reason to throw rocks at the trees and then at each other. As the year drew to a close, the map makers were still at work, blissfully unaware that they were ensuring full employment for their profession for the next 100 years. The world had more countries than it knew what to do with, and more borders than it could possibly defend. But for the moment, there was a sense of novelty. Everything was new nations, new flags, and a brand new way of manipulating time itself, as the United States decided to see if it could save the world by stealing an hour from the sun. Chapter 13. The Inverted Jenny. If there is one thing that brings the human race closer to the divine, it is not our capacity for prayer or our occasional fits of charity. It is our staggering, almost heroic ability to make a mess of things. We are a species that can take a perfectly good piece of technology, say a printing press or a flying machine, and through a moment of inspired inattention, produce a masterpiece of imbecility that the rest of the world will eventually value more than the crown jewels. By May of 1918, the United States Post Office had decided it was through with the leisurely pace of the locomotive and the horse. It wanted to take to the skies. The plan was called airmail, a concept that sounded to the average citizen of the time like a very expensive way to ensure your letter ended up in a haystack in New Jersey rather than on a desk in Philadelphia. The airplanes of the day were the Curtiss JN-4s, affectionately known as Jennies. These were fragile, temperamental contraptions made of wood, wire, and hope, which possessed the aerodynamic stability of a leaf in a gale. They were piloted by young men who were essentially testing the theory that if you go fast enough, the Earth will eventually give up on trying to pull you down. To celebrate this new era of high-velocity correspondence, the post office decided to issue a special stamp. It was to be a grand two-colored affair, a red frame surrounding a blue airplane. It was priced at 24 cents, which in 1918 was enough to buy a very decent lunch or, if you were feeling particularly frugal, a small used mule. The printing of the blunder. Now, printing a two-colored stamp is a bit like attempting to dance a waltz with two different partners at the same time. If your timing is off by a fraction of a second, everyone ends up on the floor in a heap of bruised shins. Each sheet of stamps had to go through the press twice, once for the red border and once for the blue airplane. On a fateful day in early May, at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, a gentleman whose name has been mercifully scrubbed from the official record of shame was operating the press. He had already finished the red borders. All that remained was to feed the sheets back in, so the blue jennies could be tucked neatly into their frames. At some point, however, a sheet was fed into the machine upside down. In a world governed by common sense, the printer would have noticed that the airplane was currently flying with its wheels toward the heavens and its cockpit toward the dirt. But the printer was likely a man of routine, a man who viewed his job as the repetitive movement of paper from left to right. He didn't see an airplane. He saw a blue blob. He didn't see a catastrophe. He saw the 5 o'clock whistle. And so, at least one sheet of 100 stamps was born into the world featuring a Curtiss Jenny performing a permanent, impossible loop-the-loop. It was a spectacular failure of gravity and geometry, preserved in ink and gum. The Clerk with the Eagle Eye. Enter William T. Roby. Mr. Roby was a clerk at a brokerage firm in Washington, D.C., and a man possessed of that peculiar quiet madness known as philately. A stamp collector is a person who will spend hours staring at a tiny piece of paper with a magnifying glass, looking for a chip in the ink or a slightly crooked perforation, with the same intensity a jeweler might apply to a 40-carat diamond. On May 14th, Roby walked into the post office at 13th and Pennsylvania Avenue and asked for a sheet of the new airmail stamps. The clerk, a man who likely viewed stamps as nothing more than a sticky inconvenience, reached into the drawer and pulled out a sheet. Roby looked at it. His heart, which had previously been beating at the steady pace of a bored bureaucrat, suddenly performed a vaulting leap into his throat. There they were, 100 blue airplanes all flying upside down. There is no moment in a man's life quite like the one where he realizes He is the only person in the room who knows he has just found a fortune, I have noted. It is a feeling of immense superiority, mixed with a terrifying desire to run out the door before anyone asks him for his ID. Roby didn't gasp. He didn't shout. He simply asked the clerk if there were any more sheets like this one. The clerk, perhaps sensing that Roby was a bit of a peculiar bird, checked the other drawers but found only boring stamps, where the airplanes were flying right side up. Roby paid his $24 a week's salary and walked out into the sunshine, clutching a sheet of paper that was about to become the most famous mistake in American history. The panic of the bureaucracy. When the post office realized what had happened, which occurred roughly 5 minutes after Roby left the building, the reaction was one of total, unadulterated panic. Bureaucracy is a machine designed to produce uniformity, and a mistake is viewed as a personal insult to the very concept of order. Postal inspectors were dispatched to find Roby. They went to his home, they went to his office, and they likely checked the local parks. They offered to trade him fresh stamps for his defective ones. They threatened him with legal action. They suggested that keeping the stamps was practically a form of treason. But Roby was a collector, and a collector knows that the only thing better than a perfect specimen is a spectacular disaster. He refused to give them back. He knew that the post office was currently busy burning every other inverted sheet they could find in an attempt to erase the evidence of their own imbecility. His sheet of 100 was the only one that had escaped the fire. He sold the sheet for $15,000 within the week. To put that in perspective, that was enough money to buy 15,000 very decent lunches, or a small fleet of very talented mules. The inverted Jenny had officially taken flight as the king of American stamps. The moral of the upside-down world. There is a profound irony in the fact that a pilot's failure to stay upright resulted in a fortune for a man who never left the ground. If the printer had been competent, if the inspector had been vigilant, if the clerk had been observant, the inverted Jenny would be worth exactly 24 cents today. It would be a boring, functional piece of paper. But because someone was tired or bored or perhaps just daydreaming about a girl in Virginia, a masterpiece was created. The inverted Jenny became a symbol of 1918, a year where everything felt a bit upside down. The world was at war, empires were falling, and a tiny virus was conquering the planet. In such a world, it was only fitting that our mail should be delivered by an airplane that appeared to be falling out of the sky. A mistake, I have observed, is often just a success that happened in the wrong direction. If you fail correctly enough, the world will eventually call you a genius and pay you a handsome sum for the privilege of looking at your ruins. The stamps were eventually broken up into singles and blocks, scattered to the four winds and the collections of the incredibly wealthy. They appeared in court cases, they were stolen in daring heists, and they were even used to pay off debts. One was famously lost when a collector pinned it to his shirt with a paperclip. Another was found in a dusty trunk decades later. As the first airmail pilots took to the skies over Washington, D.C., often getting lost, running out of fuel, or landing in the wrong state, the inverted Jenny remained as a tribute to the beautiful, messy, and utterly unpredictable nature of human progress. We were reaching for the stars, but we couldn't even manage to keep the blue ink on the right side of the paper. the ticking of the clock. While the post office was busy chasing Mr. Roby and his upside-down airplanes, the rest of the country was preparing for a different kind of manipulation of the natural order. We had decided that the sun itself was being a bit inefficient with its light, and that the best way to win the war was to tell everyone that 2 o'clock was actually 3 o'clock. 1918 was the year we decided to save time, as if time were something you could put in a jar and keep in the cellar for a rainy day. It was the year of the Standard Time Act and the arrival of a phenomenon that would ensure we were all grumpy and tired for 1 week every spring for the rest of eternity. The inverted Jenny was a mistake of the press. Daylight saving time was a mistake of the Congress, and as we shall see, the latter proved to be much harder to fix than an upside-down airplane. Chapter 14. Daylight Saving Time, Stealing the Sun. If there is one thing that demonstrates the staggering, unmitigated gall of the human animal, it is our belief that we can legislate the behavior of the solar system. We have, over the course of our history, attempted to ban the tides, tax the wind, and convince the rain that it ought to fall only on the property of people we don't particularly like. But in 1918, the United States government decided to engage in its most audacious swindle yet. It decided to steal an hour from the sun and hide it in a drawer until the following autumn. They called it daylight saving time, a phrase that possesses the same kind of linguistic charm as painless dentistry or honest politician. It implies that time is a physical commodity like flour or coal that can be scooped up in a bucket and set aside for a rainy day. The logic, as presented by the gentleman in Washington, was that by moving the hands of the clock forward, we would magically create an extra hour of light in the evening, thereby saving a vast quantity of fuel that would otherwise be burned in the lamps of a weary nation. It was a magnificent theory, provided you were the sort of person who believed that you could make a piece of string longer by cutting 6 inches off the top and sewing it on to the bottom. The wisdom of the professor. The architect of this celestial heist was, once again, our friend Woodrow Wilson. As we have already noted, Mr. Wilson was a man who believed that the world was merely a very large classroom that had been unfortunately populated by unruly students who refused to read the syllabus. He was convinced that efficiency was a moral virtue, and that the American people were wasting a perfectly good hour of sunshine every morning while they were busy sleeping off the previous day's labors. The idea had been floating around for some time, having been suggested by a British gentleman named William Willett, who was reportedly bothered by the fact that people were still in bed when the sun was already up and doing its job. He spent years trying to convince the British Parliament to save the light, but the British, being a sensible people who understood that the sun has its own schedule, mostly ignored him until the war made them desperate. Germany, always the first to adopt a mechanical solution to a biological problem, implemented the change in 1916. Not to be outdone in the realm of high-stakes tomfoolery, the United States passed the Standard Time Act in March of 1918. It was a wartime measure, a piece of patriotic sorcery designed to keep the factories humming and the coal bins full. The Great Temporal Heist. On the night of March 31st, 1918, the entire nation was instructed to perform a simultaneous act of chronological gymnastics. At 2 o'clock in the morning, every man, woman, and child was ordered to reach out and shove the minute hand of their clock forward by 60 minutes. Now, I have often observed that a clock is a very proud and stubborn instrument. It has spent its entire life ticking away at a steady, reliable pace, convinced that it is the ultimate authority on the progress of the universe. To suddenly tell a clock that it has been wrong by a full hour is to invite a certain level of mechanical resentment. People across the country spent that evening winding, nudging, and occasionally cursing at their timepieces, trying to convince them that 2 was, in fact, 3. But the real question, the one that kept the more philosophical citizens awake long after the new 3 o'clock had passed, was this: where did the hour go? It is a solemn thought, I have mused, that on that fateful night 100 million Americans simply lost an hour of their lives. It wasn't spent, it wasn't enjoyed, it was simply deleted from the record by a stroke of a bureaucrat's pen. One moment a man was looking forward to 60 minutes of pleasant dreaming, and the next he was being told that he was already late for breakfast. The hour vanished into the celestial attic, presumably to be kept in a cedar chest alongside our childhood innocence and our original intentions for the new year. We were told we would get it back in October, but any man who has ever lent a $5 bill to a cousin knows that getting it back later is a very elastic concept. The confusion of the creatures. While the humans were busy adjusting their watches and wondering why they felt so unaccountably peckish, the rest of the natural world remained blissfully unaware of the act of Congress. A rooster, you see, does not consult a pocket watch before he decides to announce the dawn. He operates on a system of light and instinct, 2 things that are remarkably resistant to federal legislation. On the morning of April 1st, the roosters of America crowed exactly when the sun told them to, which was now an hour late, according to the government. This resulted in a great deal of confusion in the farmyards as disgruntled farmers stumbled out of bed in the dark, trying to convince their livestock that the schedule had changed. The cows were even more indignant. A cow is a creature of habit and a very strict follower of her own internal plumbing. If she is accustomed to being milked at 6 o'clock, she expects a pair of warm hands at 6 o'clock. When the farmer showed up at 5 o'clock, which the clock insisted was 6, the cow simply looked at him with a weary, mournful expression that said, "My dear fellow, I don't care what they decided in Washington, the milk isn't ready yet." The national grumpiness. The first week of daylight saving time was characterized by a level of national irritability that had not been seen since the great umbrella shortage of '84. The American people discovered that you cannot simply save an hour without paying for it in the currency of fatigue. Men arrived at their offices with their hats on sideways and their eyes looking like 2 holes burnt in a blanket. Children were dragged to school while they were still in the middle of a perfectly good dream about a circus. The entire country felt as though it had been collectively swindled by a traveling salesman who had sold them a patent sunshine extender that only worked if you didn't mind being exhausted for the rest of your natural life. The proponents of the plan pointed to the coal bins. "Look," they cried, "we are saving millions of tons of fuel." And perhaps they were, but they failed to account for the vast quantities of coffee and nerve tonic that were being consumed to keep the population from falling asleep into their soup. Efficiency, I have noted, is a very fine thing if you are a steam engine or a printing press. But a human being is a creature that requires a certain amount of wasted time just to keep his soul from shrinking. When you start trying to squeeze more work out of a man by stealing his sleep, you end up with a man who is very efficient at being miserable. The Farmers' Rebellion. The most vociferous opponents of the fast time, as it was called by those who hated it, were the farmers. To a man who lives by the soil, the clock is a minor annoyance. The sun is the only boss that matters. The farmers pointed out that the dew does not dry on the hay any faster just because the president says it's 8 o'clock. If they went into the fields an hour earlier, the hay was too wet to work. If they waited for the sun to do its job, they found themselves working an hour later into the evening, long after the hired hands had decided they wanted to go to the pictures. They argued that daylight saving time was a city slicker's invention, a way for bankers and lawyers to have an extra hour of golf in the evening while the men who actually produced the food were being driven into the ground. It was a classic American struggle, the urban desire for leisure versus the rural reality of labor. And for the duration of the war, the urbanites had the upper hand. The moral of the stolen hour. The experiment of 1918 proved that while you can lead a man to a clock, you cannot make him believe it. The American people endured the stolen hour with a grim, patriotic stoicism. But the moment the war ended, the grumbling turned into a roar. The Standard Time Act was repealed in 1919 over the veto of Woodrow Wilson, who was still convinced that he could fix the universe if people would only listen to him. The farmers had won. The clocks were returned to their natural God-fearing positions, and the sun was once again allowed to set whenever it felt like it. But the seed had been planted. The government had discovered that it could manipulate time, and like a boy who has found a way to make the school bell ring early, they couldn't wait to try it again. Daylight saving time would return in later years, eventually becoming a permanent fixture of our lives, a twice-yearly ritual of confusion and clock winding that reminds us that no matter how much progress we make, we are still a species that believes we can trick the universe with a screwdriver and a bit of legislation. As the sun set on the first year of the great time experiment, the world felt a little bit more mechanical, a little bit more managed, and a little bit more tired. We had won the battle for efficiency, but we had lost the battle for the morning, and as we shall see in the next chapter, while we were busy trying to control the clocks, the government was also busy trying to control what we said, proving that in 1918, the only thing more dangerous than a man who wanted to save your time was a man who wanted to save your thoughts. The silence of the tongue. While the clocks were being nudged forward, the free speech that we all held so dear was being nudged backward. The war effort demanded unity, and unity, it seemed, required that everyone say exactly the same thing at exactly the same volume. The Sedition Act was looming, a piece of legislation that turned a critical remark into a federal crime and proved that in a war for democracy, the first thing you have to get rid of is the right to complain about it. Chapter 15, The Sedition Act. Liberty, as I have frequently had occasion to observe, is a remarkably fair-weather friend. In times of peace, she is the belle of the ball, draped in the finest bunting and whispering sweet promises of inalienable rights and unfettered expression into the ears of every passing citizen. We build monuments to her, we write poems to her, and we generally treat her with the reverence one might accord a wealthy and elderly aunt, from whom one expects a significant inheritance. But the moment a bugle sounds or a drop of ink is spilled on a declaration of war, liberty is whisked away to the attic, the curtains are drawn, and the family is told in no uncertain terms that for the duration of the unpleasantness, Aunt Liberty is feeling a bit indisposed and would much prefer it if everyone would kindly shut their mouths and stop asking difficult questions. By May of 1918, the United States was well into its second year of making the world safe for democracy. It was a noble endeavor, a crusade of high ideals led by our bespectacled professor-in-chief, Woodrow Wilson. But there was a growing suspicion in Washington that democracy was such a fragile and delicate thing that the only way to save it was to ensure that nobody actually practiced it at home until the danger had passed. To this end, Congress passed the Sedition Act, a piece of legislation that turned a critical remark into a federal offense and proved that while an American has a God-given right to his opinion, he has no such right to let it escape through his teeth. The architecture of silence. The Sedition Act was an amendment to the earlier Espionage Act, which had been aimed at catching real, honest-to-goodness spies, gentlemen with dark cloaks, false mustaches, and a distressing habit of sketching fortifications on the back of their cocktail napkins. But the Sedition Act was far more ambitious. It didn't care about what you did. It cared about what you said. The law made it a crime to utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government, the Constitution, the military, or even the uniform of the Army or Navy. Now, scurrilous is one of those marvelous elastic words that lawyers love, as it can be stretched to cover anything from a call for violent revolution to a mild suggestion that the local postmaster is perhaps not the swiftest creature in the forest. Under this law, if you were to remark to a neighbor that the Army's wool socks were a bit itchy, you were technically guilty of abusive language toward the military. If you suggested that the flag was being used to sell a questionable brand of laundry soap, you were being scurrilous. The government had essentially declared that patriotism was now a compulsory performance, and that any man who failed to clap loud enough at the mention of the president's name was liable to find himself discussing his lack of enthusiasm with a federal judge. The Grand Inquisitor of the Mails. The man tasked with enforcing this silence was the Postmaster General, a gentleman named Albert S. Burleson. Now, I have already remarked upon the post office's relationship with the inverted Jenny, but Mr. Burleson was interested in a different kind of delivery. He was given the power to decide which newspapers, magazines, and letters were fit for the American eye. Burleson was a man who possessed the moral imagination of a stone wall. He believed that any publication that didn't read like a government press release was a threat to the national soul. He shut down socialist newspapers, Irish-American journals, and even a few pacifist newsletters that suggested that perhaps killing people was a poor way to settle a geographical dispute. He didn't need a court order. He simply declared a publication non-mailable, which in 1918 was the equivalent of a death sentence. Without the mail, a newspaper was just a collection of very expensive trash. Burleson became the nation's censor-in-chief, a man who could silence 1,000 voices with a single stroke of his blue pencil. There is no man quite so dangerous, I have noted, as a bureaucrat who believes he is doing God's work by ensuring that nobody ever hears a word he doesn't like. He is like a man who tries to improve the music by cutting all the strings on the violin except for the one that plays the note he finds most agreeable. The case of the socialist and the speech. The most famous victim of this era of managed speech was a man named Eugene V. Debs. Debs was a socialist, a labor leader, and a man who possessed a voice that could make a statue stand up and look for a Union card. In June of 1918, he gave a speech in Canton, Ohio, in which he spoke out against the war and the draft. Now, Debs didn't tell anyone to blow up a bridge or steal a battleship. He simply pointed out that wars were usually declared by the masters and fought by the peasants, and that the working man had very little to gain from being turned into a statistic in a French meadow. It was a standard socialist argument, the kind of thing that had been said in saloons and meeting halls for decades. But under the Sedition Act, this was obstructing recruitment. Debs was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Think of it, 10 years for a speech. The judge, in his infinite wisdom, suggested that Debs's words were like a spark in a powder magazine, which is a very poetic way of saying that the government was terrified that if people started thinking for themselves, they might stop doing what they were told. Debs eventually ran for president from his prison cell, inmate number 9653, and received nearly 1 million votes. It was the only time in American history that a man campaigned for the White House while wearing a striped suit and eating porridge under the watchful eye of an armed guard. The terror of the knitting circle. But the law didn't just catch the big fish like Debs. It swept up a vast number of minnows, whose only crime was a lack of social tact. There was the case of a man in Minnesota who was arrested for telling a group of women that the Red Cross was a bunch of grafters. There was a woman in New York who was investigated because she refused to buy a Liberty bond and told the solicitor that she didn't believe in organized murder. There were even cases of people being hauled into court for scaring others into not supporting the war by describing the horrors of the trenches with a bit too much accuracy. The country was gripped by a white terror, a fever of conformity where every citizen became a volunteer spy. Neighbors peeked through curtains, co-workers listened at the water cooler, and if you weren't seen wearing a flag pin or singing the Star-Spangled Banner with sufficient gusto, you were likely to be reported to the American Protective League. This was a group of 250,000 private citizens who had been given government badges and told to look for slackers and pro-Germans. It was a magnificent time to be a busybody. If you had a grudge against a neighbor because his dog barked or his fence was too high, you simply had to whisper to the League that you heard him speaking German in his sleep, and the government would take care of the rest. The irony of the 14 points. The grand irony, of course, was that while Woodrow Wilson was telling the world about his 14 points and the freedom of the seas and the self-determination of peoples, he was presiding over a nation where a man could be jailed for reading the wrong book. Wilson believed that in order to protect democracy abroad, he had to suspend it at home. It was the logic of the surgeon who decides that the best way to save the patient's leg is to amputate his head. The war for democracy became a war against the Democrat, and the land of the free became the land of the keep your mouth shut or else. A man who thinks he can promote liberty by putting his critics in a cage, I might have remarked, is like a man who thinks he can encourage the birds to sing by wringing their necks. He will certainly achieve a certain level of quiet, but he will find that the morning is remarkably lacking in melody. The Sedition Act remained on the books until 1920, but the damage it did to the American psyche lasted far longer. It established the idea that in times of crisis, the Constitution is merely a set of suggestions that can be ignored if the authorities feel a bit nervous. It turned the citizen into a suspect and the government into an inquisitor. The distraction of the loincloth. As the year 1918 drew to a close, the American people were exhausted. They were tired of the war, they were tired of the flu, and they were particularly tired of having to watch what they said every time they stepped out the door. They were looking for an escape, a place where they didn't have to worry about sedition acts, Liberty bonds, or the Spanish lady. And they found it in the dark, flicker-filled rooms of the moving picture house. They found a man who didn't care about uniforms or government decrees, a man who lived in the jungle, yelled at monkeys, and wore a piece of leopard skin that would have given a postmaster general a terminal case of the vapors. They found Tarzan. The Great War was ending, but a new kind of uncivilized joyride was about to begin in the theaters of America. We had spent the year being told what to think and how to feel, and now we were ready to pay a nickel to watch a man swing on a vine and forget that the world was currently falling apart. The Sedition Act had silenced the tongue, but it couldn't silence the desire for a good story. And as the guns fell silent in France, the projector started hummings to Peoria, proving that even in a year of total chaos, the human race will always find a way to distract itself with a man in a loincloth. Chapter 16, Tarzan of the Apes, the first movie. By the summer of 1918, the human race was in a state of spiritual exhaustion that would have made a marathon runner look like a toddler on a sugar high. Between the Great War, which refused to stop even after it had run out of reasons for existing, and the Spanish lady, who was currently making her way through the world's lungs like a particularly unwelcome house guest, there was a profound and desperate shortage of what a man might call frivolous nonsense. We had spent so much time being serious, being patriotic, and being terrified that we had forgotten how to be amused by things that didn't involve a national anthem or a casualty list. It was into this atmosphere of grim rectitude and surgical gauze that a man named Elmo Lincoln stepped, or rather swung. He was the star of a moving picture called Tarzan of the Apes, and he was about to prove that the best way to forget the collapse of Western civilization was to watch a large, barrel-chested gentleman in a leopard-skin loincloth yell at a group of people dressed in very unconvincing ape suits. The architecture of the flicker. Now, the moving picture was still a relatively new magic in those days. To a man who remembered the slow, dignified pace of a stereopticon or a well-rehearsed stage play, the cinema was a frantic, flicker-filled assault on the senses. You sat in a darkened room, smelling of popcorn and the previous occupant's pomade, and watched a white sheet as it was bombarded by a beam of light. It was a technological miracle that allowed a man to travel to the deepest, darkest corners of the African jungle for the price of a nickel, all while remaining in a chair in Peoria, Illinois. The author of the original story was a gentleman named Edgar Rice Burroughs. Now, Mr. Burroughs was a man of immense imagination and a profound lack of geographical experience. He had never been to Africa. He had, in fact, spent most of his life in Chicago, which is a jungle of a different sort, primarily involving wind and politicians. But Burroughs understood something that the map-makers and the generals had forgotten. The human heart doesn't want the truth. It wants a rattling good yarn. He imagined a world where a British aristocrat, a Lord Greystoke no less, is orphaned in the jungle and raised by a tribe of great apes. It was a theory that would have made Mr. Darwin stroke his beard in quiet contemplation, though Darwin's theories usually involved more natural selection and significantly less wrestling with crocodiles. The casting of the king. When the time came to put Tarzan on the screen, the producers were faced with a dilemma. They needed a man who looked like he had been raised by primates, which in 1918 was a description that could have applied to half the professional wrestlers in the country. They eventually settled on Elmo Lincoln. Now, Elmo was not a man of the slender and athletic variety that we might see in the gymnasiums of today. He was a man of considerable bulk. He possessed a chest that looked like a roll-top desk and arms that were roughly the circumference of a mature oak tree. He was a strong man in the old-fashioned sense, a man who looked as though he could carry a grand piano up a flight of stairs and then ask for a glass of water without losing his breath. The wardrobe for the production was, as I have noted, remarkably economical. In a year where the government was regulating the amount of wool in a man's trousers and the length of his coat sleeves, Elmo Lincoln spent the entire movie in a piece of faux leopard skin. It was a silent protest against the industrial machine, a return to a time before buttons, zippers, and the general inconvenience of the haberdasher. There is a profound freedom in the loincloth, I have often mused. It is the only garment in the history of man that refuses to be intimidated by a starch-collared bureaucrat. You cannot tax a man's dignity when he is already wearing his pajamas in public. The Louisiana jungle. The production of Tarzan of the Apes was conducted with a spirit of make-believe that would have been charming if it hadn't been so remarkably damp. Since the producers were not particularly interested in shipping a cast, a crew, and a barrel-chested strongman across the Atlantic in the middle of a U-boat-infested war, they decided to bring Africa to Louisiana. They filmed in the swamps of Morgan City, a place that possesses a great many mosquitoes, an abundance of Spanish moss, and a humidity level that can turn a man's boots into a bowl of soup in under an hour. To the camera, a Louisiana swamp looks remarkably like a Congo jungle, provided you don't look too closely at the alligators and the local flora. The apes were played by a group of acrobats and local enthusiasts who were sewn into suits made of goatskin and cotton. On screen, in the grainy, flickering black and white of 1918, they looked terrifying. In person, they likely looked like a group of men who were currently questioning every life decision that had led them to a swamp in a goat suit during a heat wave. The highlight of the film, of course, was Elmo Lincoln's interaction with the wildlife. There is a scene where Tarzan kills a lion, a real lion, mind you, which Elmo reportedly did with a knife and a great deal of enthusiasm. It was a moment of uncivilized joy that resonated with the audience. We were tired of the mechanical, impersonal death of the machine gun and the mustard gas. We wanted to see a man win a fight with his own two hands against a predator he could actually see. The silence of the shout. Although the film was silent, the audience could hear the Tarzan yell. It was written on Elmo's face. It was expressed in the way he threw back his head and expanded that magnificent desk-like chest. The theater orchestras, usually a harried piano player or a small group of musicians trying to keep up with the action, would provide a dramatic crescendo of brass and percussion to signify the roar. The people of 1918 flocked to the theaters. They stood in lines that stretched around the block, braving the flu and the boredom of the home front, to see a man who didn't care about the 14 points or the Sedition Act. Tarzan was the ultimate draft dodger. He didn't have a passport, he didn't have a social security number, and he certainly didn't have to fill out a Form 1040. He lived in a world where the only law was the law of the jungle, which is a much simpler affair involving who has the sharpest knife and the loudest voice. Tarzan was the noble savage come to life, a reminder that underneath our starched shirts and our polished shoes, we were all still just a few generations away from wanting to swing on a vine and yell at a monkey. It was a magnificent distraction. For 90 minutes, a man could forget that his son was in the Argonne, or that his wife was sneezing into a handkerchief. He could believe, if only for a moment, that life was a simple matter of rescue and romance conducted in a loincloth in a Louisiana jungle. The moral of the loincloth. The success of Tarzan of the Apes launched a franchise that would outlive everyone who saw it that first summer. It spawned sequels, radio shows, comic strips, and eventually a television series featuring a man who could communicate with a chimpanzee named Cheetah with more clarity than most politicians communicate with their constituents. But in 1918, Tarzan was more than a character. He was a symptom. He was the manifestation of a global desire to return to a state of nature, or at least a version of nature, that had been edited for the screen and featured a hero who never seemed to get a scratch from the brambles. We had built a world of iron, steel, and high explosives, and we discovered that we were remarkably homesick for the trees. Civilization, I have observed, is a process of trading our freedom for a better set of plumbing. We gain the bathtub, but we lose the ability to swing through the air without being arrested for trespassing. Tarzan is the man who kept the freedom and decided the plumbing was overrated. As the year 1918 began its final weary slide toward the Armistice, the image of Elmo Lincoln remained in the public mind. He was the antidote to the Great War. While the generals were counting their casualties and the politicians were redrawing the maps, Tarzan was just looking for Jane. He was the first movie star of the modern age, a man who proved that if you want to capture the heart of the human race, you don't need a manifesto or a machine gun. You just need a good vine and a very small amount of leopard skin. The distraction of the cinema was a necessary medicine for a sick world, but as we shall see, the world was still capable of producing a different kind of heart, a candy heart, to be precise. For while Tarzan was swinging in the jungle, a man was sitting at a drawing board in the city, creating a doll that would prove that in a year of so much hate, a little bit of cotton and a heart that said, "I love you," was exactly what the toy industry ordered. Chapter 17. Raggedy Ann and the Doll with the Heart. It is a curious and often overlooked fact that while the great powers of the earth are busy inventing new and efficient ways to turn one another into memories, the small, quiet corners of the human spirit are usually occupied with something entirely different, something involving cotton, yarn, and a significant amount of sentimentality. In 1918, the world was a clanging, iron-bound factory of destruction. We had the tank, the Zeppelin, and the long-range artillery piece that could drop a shell on a man's breakfast from 3 counties away. We were, as a species, very heavily invested in things that were hard, cold, and loud. But in a small studio in Connecticut, a gentleman named Johnny Gruelle was busy perfecting a piece of technology that was soft, warm, and remarkably quiet. He was creating a doll. Now, a doll is not a weapon of war unless you happen to be a parent who has tripped over one in a dark hallway at 2 o'clock in the morning. But in a year where the Spanish lady was knocking on every door and the Sedition Act was making sure everyone kept their thoughts to themselves, a rag doll with a permanent painted-on smile was a more radical invention than anyone realized. It was a protest in calico. It was an insurrection of affection. The resurrection from the attic. The origin of Raggedy Ann is one of those stories that possesses the dusty, golden glow of a legend found in a cedar chest. According to the tale, which has been polished by time and the occasional marketing department, Johnny Gruelle's daughter Marcella had been exploring her grandmother's attic. Now, an attic is a place where time goes to take a nap, and where the discarded relics of previous generations wait patiently for someone to rediscover them and wonder why on earth anyone ever thought a velvet-covered footstool shaped like a turtle was a good idea. Marcella emerged from the shadows clutching a faceless, battered rag doll that had belonged to her grandmother. It was a pathetic sight. A lump of faded cloth with yarn hair that had seen better days and a general air of being entirely overlooked by the progress of the 19th century. Johnny, being a cartoonist and an illustrator, a man whose trade involved bringing life to the inanimate with a few strokes of a pen, didn't see a piece of trash. He saw a canvas. He sat down at his drawing board and gave the doll a face. He gave her 2 large black button eyes that possessed a look of permanent, wide-eyed wonder, and a wide, red, smiling mouth that suggested she had just heard a very funny joke and was waiting for you to catch the punchline. He named her Raggedy Ann, a title he plucked from the poetry of James Whitcomb Riley, combining the Raggedy Man and Orphaned Annie. It was a name that sounded like a patchwork quilt, a bit of this, a bit of that, and a whole lot of home. The anatomical miracle of sugar. But Johnny Gruelle didn't stop at the face. He decided that if Raggedy Ann was going to survive in a world as difficult and weary as 1918, she needed something that most people seemed to be running short of: a heart. He didn't just paint a heart on her chest. He didn't just sew a piece of red felt to her tunic. No, Johnny Gruelle had a much more whimsical and entirely impractical idea. He took a real, honest-to-goodness candy heart, the kind that might say, "Be mine," or sweet talk in a more romantic setting, and he sewed it deep inside the doll's cotton-stuffed chest. On this particular heart, however, were written the words, "I love you." Think of the sheer magnificent absurdity of it. In a year where the great nations were pouring their hearts into the production of steel-jacketed lead, a man in Connecticut was putting a heart made of sugar into a body made of rags. It was a secret organ, a hidden source of sweetness that the child could feel but never see. There is a profound theological lesson to be found in a candy heart, I have often mused. It suggests that even if the outer shell is a bit worn and the yarn hair is a bit tangled, the internal machinery is made of pure kindness. And if things get truly desperate, you can always eat your own heart to keep from starving, which is more than you can say for most of the people I've met in Washington. The I love you heart became the trademark of the doll. It was a silent promise. While the newspapers were full of I hate you and I will defeat you and I will occupy your provinces, the doll sat quietly in the nursery, radiating a constant sugary benevolence. The commercialization of comfort. In 1918, Johnny Gruelle began publishing the Raggedy Ann stories. These were tales of a world where toys came to life when the humans weren't looking, a concept that has since been used to sell a great many tickets to the moving pictures, but which in 1918 felt like a much-needed glimpse into a gentler reality. In these stories, Raggedy Ann was the moral compass of the nursery. She wasn't a princess. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a sophisticated lady with a wardrobe of Parisian gowns. She was just a rag doll who was brave and kind and good. She went on adventures with her brother Raggedy Andy and a cast of characters with names like the Camel, with the wrinkled knees, and the Quaily Whaley. The toy industry, which had previously been dominated by rigid, breakable dolls from Germany, the very country we were currently trying to bomb back into the Stone Age, suddenly realized that the American public wanted something they could actually squeeze. They wanted a doll that wouldn't shatter if you dropped it, and that wouldn't look down its nose at you if you had a hole in your sock. Raggedy Ann was a smash hit. She was mass-produced by the P.F. Volland Company, and thousands of dolls with candy hearts were shipped out to homes across the country. In a year of so much hate, a doll with a candy heart was exactly what the doctor ordered, provided the doctor wasn't currently busy dealing with the flu and could spare a moment to appreciate the therapeutic value of a yarn-haired companion. The moral of the stuffed bag. The success of Raggedy Ann reminds us that human beings are, at their core, remarkably soft creatures. We like to pretend we are made of iron and resolve, but we spend a significant portion of our lives looking for something to cuddle. 1918 was a year of the big armies, big debts, big pandemics, and big ideals. But Raggedy Ann was small. She was a reminder that the world is built one heart at a time, and that if those hearts are made of sugar and say, I love you, the world might just be a place worth living in after all. Johnny Gruelle had created more than a toy. He had created a sentinel of childhood. Raggedy Ann didn't care about the Armistice, or the Kaiser's flight, or the Sedition Act. She only cared about the child who held her. She was a witness to the secret tears shed in the dark when the news from the front was bad, and she was the silent recipient of the sticky kisses of a generation that was being raised in the shadow of a global catastrophe. A doll is the only friend who will listen to your problems for 3 hours and never once interrupt to tell you about his own, I have noted. And if that friend happens to have a candy heart, you can be certain that his advice, while silent, is at least coming from a place of sweetness. As the year drew to a close, Raggedy Ann sat on bookshelves and bedsides from Maine to California. She was a patch of color in a gray world, a bit of softness in a hard time. And while the men in Paris were busy trying to figure out how to divide the world, Johnny Gruelle had already figured out how to heal it, one rag doll at a time. The curse of the Red Sox. But the year 1918 was not all candy hearts and nursery rhymes. While the children were hugging their dolls, the men of Boston were celebrating a victory that would eventually turn into a haunting. The Red Sox had won the World Series, a feat that seemed perfectly normal at the time, but which was about to be followed by a decision so monumentally foolish it would become the longest "I told you so" in the history of sport. A fellow named Babe Ruth was about to change his uniform, and in doing so, he was about to cast a shadow over Boston that would last for 86 years, a shadow much darker than any cast by the Spanish lady or the Kaiser's helmet. Chapter 18. The Red Sox win. The curse begins. Man is a creature that requires a certain amount of organized conflict to keep his humors in balance. If he is not provided with a grand, world-shaking war to occupy his afternoons, he will invariably invent a game involving a stick and a ball, and then proceed to invest that game with a level of solemnity and tribal ferocity that would make a crusader look like a man out for a casual Sunday stroll. By September of 1918, the American public was, as we have established, thoroughly saturated with the business of the Great War. We had seen enough maps of the Western Front to last us several lifetimes, and we were beginning to find the constant talk of strategic salients and logistical breakthroughs about as exciting as a lecture on the proper way to dry a salt cod. We were a nation looking for a distraction that didn't involve mustard gas, and we found it in the World Series. Now, the World Series of 1918 was a peculiar affair, conducted under the shadow of a government edict known as the Work or Fight Order. This was a piece of federal logic that suggested that if a man wasn't doing something useful, like building a battleship or digging a trench, he ought to be sent to France to find out exactly how itchy a wool uniform can be. Professional baseball, according to the gentleman in Washington, was not an essential occupation. It was decided that the season would have to end early, and the World Series would have to be played in the first week of September, lest the players be mistaken for slackers and handed a rifle before the seventh inning stretch. The Battle of the Unlucky. The contest featured the Boston Red Sox and the Chicago Cubs. At the time, the Red Sox were the undisputed kings of the diamond. They were a dynasty, a collection of talent that viewed winning a championship with the same casual regularity that a banker views a foreclosure. They had already won 4 titles in the previous 15 years, and they arrived at the series with the smug, self-assured air of a man who knows he has the only royal flush in the room. The Cubs, on the other hand, were already beginning to develop that look of haunted, wide-eyed desperation that would eventually become their permanent facial expression for the next century. The games were played in a world that felt fundamentally altered. Because of the war, there was no brass band, no ticker tape, and a distinct lack of the usual rowdy enthusiasm. The crowds were smaller, the players were nervous about their draft status, and the whole event had the atmosphere of a very expensive funeral for a sport that everyone feared might not survive the winter. It was during this series that the Star-Spangled Banner was first played during the 7th inning stretch, a patriotic gesture that eventually became a mandatory ritual, proving once again that if you do something once in America out of necessity, someone will eventually make a law saying you have to do it forever out of habit. The arrival of the Colossus. But the real story of the 1918 World Series was not the score, nor the war, nor the music. It was a 23-year-old fellow named George Herman Ruth, better known to the world as the Babe, or the Bambino, or to his teammates as a man with an appetite for hot dogs and trouble that was truly gargantuan in its proportions. In 1918, Ruth was primarily a pitcher, and a magnificent one at that. He possessed a left arm that seemed to have been engineered by a bridge builder, capable of throwing a baseball with a velocity that made the batter wonder if he had accidentally insulted the ball's mother. In the series, he pitched nearly 30 consecutive scoreless innings, a feat of athletic endurance that suggested he might be more machine than man. But Ruth was also beginning to discover that he had a talent for hitting the ball, hitting it with such violence and trajectory that it frequently left the park altogether, much to the surprise of the outfielders who were used to a more sedentary afternoon. He was a transitional creature, a missing link between the dead ball era of bunts and stolen bases and the power era of home runs and shattered windows. Babe Ruth, I have often noted, was a man of large appetites and even larger swings. He lived life with the volume turned up to 11, and he viewed a baseball not as a piece of sporting equipment, but as a personal affront that needed to be launched into the next county as quickly as possible. The Red Sox won the series in 6 games. They hoisted the trophy, collected their checks, and went home to wait for the war to end. They were the champions of the world, the toast of Boston, and the envy of every man who ever picked up a bat. They had no idea that they were currently standing on the edge of a precipice and that they were about to be pushed off by a man who was much more interested in the theater than the dugout. The villain of the piece. Enter Harry Frazee. Mr. Frazee was the owner of the Red Sox, but his heart belonged to Broadway. He was a theatrical producer, a man who believed that life was a musical comedy and that a baseball team was merely a convenient way to fund his next opening night. He was a man of grand gestures and precarious bank accounts, and by the end of 1918, he was in a bit of a financial pickle. Frazee had a problem with Babe Ruth. The Babe was becoming too big for his britches. He wanted more money, he wanted to hit more and pitch less, and he had a distressing habit of staying out until 4 in the morning and returning to the hotel smelling of cheap gin and expensive cigars. To a man of the theater, this behavior was perfectly normal, but to a man who had to manage a locker room, it was a headache that no amount of aspirin could cure. Frazee looked at Ruth and saw a very valuable, albeit very loud, asset. He also looked at his mounting debts and a new play he wanted to produce, a little something called No, No, Nanette. In a decision that will forever remain the gold standard for human folly, Frazee decided to sell the greatest player in the history of the game to the New York Yankees for the sum of $100,000 and a $300,000 loan. The birth of the curse. The transaction was completed shortly after the 1918 season. To Frazee, it was a brilliant business move. He got the cash, he got the loan, and he got rid of a troublesome left-hander who was starting to get a bit too much press. To the city of New York, it was the beginning of a dynasty that would dominate the sport for the next 100 years. But to the city of Boston, it was the beginning of the curse. The Red Sox, having won 5 championships in 15 years, suddenly forgot how to win anything at all. They became the also-rans, the Heartbreak Kids, the team that could find a way to lose a game even if the opposition didn't show up. For 86 years, the ghost of Babe Ruth haunted Fenway Park, appearing in the form of ground balls that went through legs, pitches that went wild, and a general, pervasive sense of impending doom that settled over the city every October like a thick, salty fog. There is no more exquisite form of torture, I have observed, than being a sports fan in a city that believes it is cursed. It allows you to invest your life with a sense of tragic grandeur while simultaneously giving you a very good reason to drink a great deal of beer and shout at the television. The curse of the Bambino became a part of the American mythology. It was a story of greed, hubris, and the terrible price of trading a legend for a musical comedy. While the Yankees were busy winning 26 World Series titles with Ruth and his successors, the Red Sox were busy perfecting the art of the near miss. The moral of the diamond. The 1918 World Series was the last time Boston would taste victory for nearly a century. It was a year of triumph that carried the seeds of a long, slow rot. It reminds us that in the grand game of life, we are often at the mercy of men who don't understand the value of what they hold. Harry Frazee sold a diamond to buy a costume, and in doing so, he ensured that generations of Bostonians would grow up with a profound understanding of the word disappointment. As the year 1918 drew to a close, the Red Sox were champions, but the shadows were lengthening. The Great War was ending, and the world was trying to return to normal, but normal now included a New York team that was suddenly very, very dangerous, and a Boston team that was starting to feel a bit of a chill in the air. Baseball had survived the war, but it hadn't survived Harry Frazee. And as the fans in Boston packed away their pennants and prepared for the winter, they had no way of knowing that they wouldn't need to buy a world champion's hat again until the year 2004. By which time, I suspect, most of them would have forgotten what the original victory felt like, though they would never, ever forget the name of the man who sold their soul to New York. The curse was in the ground, the babe was on the train, and the 20th century was rounding second base and heading for home. Chapter 19. Sergeant Alvin York's Return. If you were to search the wide, weary world for a man who possessed the least possible desire to be a legend, you would eventually find yourself standing on a muddy hillside in Pall Mall, Tennessee, talking to a fellow named Alvin York. Now, the hills of Tennessee are a place where the air is sweet, the shadows are long, and the local inhabitants have spent the better part of a century perfecting the art of being left entirely alone. It is a landscape of profound quiet, interrupted only by the occasional barking of a hound, or the sharp crack of a long rifle being used to convince a wild turkey that it is time to contribute to the family dinner. Alvin York was a man of the soil, a man of the book, and a man who possessed a squint that suggested he could see a flea on the back of a dog from 3 counties away. He was also a conscientious objector, a term that in 1918 was viewed by the United States Army with the same enthusiasm a cat views a sudden bath. York didn't believe in killing. He believed that the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," was a fairly straightforward instruction, not a multiple-choice question where unless they are wearing gray uniforms, was a valid answer. But the Army, in its infinite capacity for ignoring the personal preferences of the individual, decided that York's ability to put a bullet through a knothole at 100 yards was far too valuable a talent to be wasted on the peaceful hills of Tennessee. They handed him a rifle, a helmet that didn't fit, and a ticket to France, effectively telling him that while he might object to the war certainly didn't object to him. The theology of the trenches. Before he sailed, York had a long private conversation with the Almighty on a limestone bluff overlooking his home. We don't have the transcript of that meeting, heavenly telegrams being notoriously difficult to intercept, but it seems a compromise was reached. York concluded that if he went to war to end the war, he was doing the Lord's work, albeit in a remarkably noisy and violent fashion. He decided that if he had to thin the herd of the Kaiser's men to save his own boys, it was a piece of grim arithmetic that the Creator would eventually forgive. By October of 1918, York found himself in the Argonne Forest, a place we have previously described as a vertical thicket of brambles and bad intentions. He was a corporal in the 82nd Division, the All-American Division, a group of men who had been sent into the woods to find the German machine guns and ask them to please stop making so much noise. On the morning of October 8th, York's unit was pinned down by a nest of German guns that was spitting lead with the mechanical indifference of a sewing machine. Most of the officers were down, most of the sergeants were gone, and Alvin York found himself in charge of a handful of frightened privates who were currently trying to make themselves as small as possible in the French mud. The Tennessee turkey shoot. It was at this point that York's backwoods upbringing took over. He realized that the Germans were sitting in their nests, popping their heads up to see where the Americans were, and then ducking back down to pull the trigger. To a man who had spent his life hunting squirrels and competing in turkey shoots, this was a familiar pattern. York didn't panic. He didn't shout. He simply sat down in the dirt, took a deep breath of the sulphurous air, and waited. Every time a German head appeared above the parapet, York would let out a small, sharp gobble, the sound a hunter makes to get a turkey to lift its neck. The German, being a curious creature, would look up to see what kind of bird was making such a noise in the middle of a battle, and York would promptly put a bullet through his hat. There is a profound efficiency in the country boy, I have often noted. He does not waste ammunition on the scenery, and he does not believe in the dramatic gesture. He simply views the enemy as a particularly difficult variety of livestock that needs to be herded into the next world with a minimum of fuss. After he had picked off a significant number of the gunners, a group of Germans decided to charge him with bayonets. York, having run out of rifle ammunition, pulled his .45 caliber pistol and began shooting them from the back to the front, a tactic he had learned while hunting wild hogs, so that the ones in the lead wouldn't see their friends falling and scatter before he could finish the job. It was a masterpiece of cold mountain logic applied to the chaos of the industrial age. The Parade of the Vanquished. By the time the smoke cleared, York had personally killed 28 Germans and silenced 35 machine guns. But the most whimsical part of the tragedy was what happened next. A German officer, a major named Vollmer, who had been watching his men disappear with the speed of a melting icicle, decided that he was facing an entire American battalion, rather than one man from Tennessee. He walked out with a white flag and asked York how many men he had. York, with a straight face and a steady hand, replied that he had plenty. The major surrendered his entire force. York and his 7 remaining privates then began the long march back to the American lines, leading a parade of 132 German prisoners. Imagine the scene. A tall, lanky fellow with a red mustache and a tired expression, walking through the woods with a handful of boys, followed by a column of the Kaiser's finest, all of whom looked as though they had just been defeated by a ghost. When they reached the headquarters, the brigadier general looked at the column and asked, "Well, York, I hear you've captured the whole German army." York simply saluted and said, "No, sir, I only got 132 of 'em." The return of the reluctant hero. When the news of York's feat reached America, the nation went into a fit of paroxysmal joy. We had been looking for a hero who didn't look like a politician and didn't talk like a general. We found him in the Singing Elder from the hills. York was awarded the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and more French medals than a man could reasonably wear without listing to one side. But York didn't want the glory. He didn't want the ticker-tape parade in New York, though he endured it with the stoic patience of a man watching a very long and very boring rainstorm. He didn't want the movie deals or the product endorsements. When he was offered thousands of dollars to appear on the stage, he refused, saying that he didn't believe in merchandising the dead. He just wanted to go back to Pall Mall. He wanted to marry his sweetheart, Gracie, and he wanted to build a school for the children of the mountains so they wouldn't have to grow up as ignorant as he felt he had been. A true hero, I have observed, is a man who performs a miracle and then immediately asks for directions to the nearest exit. He does not want to be a monument. He wants to be a person again. And there is no greater punishment you can give a man like that than to put his face on a postage stamp and tell him he is a symbol of the national spirit. The moral of the long rifle. Alvin York's return was the final human postscript to the Great War. He represented the common man who had been swept up in the great machine and had somehow managed to come out the other side with his soul intact. He proved that you could be a pacifist and a warrior, a Christian and a killer, a hero and a neighbor, all at the same time, provided you had a steady eye and a clear conscience. He spent the rest of his life working for the people of Tennessee, a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and decided that the best response was to teach a child how to read. He remained a man of quiet dignity, a man who rarely spoke of the war, and who viewed his medals as a bit of a burden, a reminder of a day in the woods that he would have much rather spent hunting real turkeys. As the year 1918 drew to a close, Sergeant Alvin York was back in his hills. The Spanish lady was finally packing her bags, and the world was heading to France to see if they could turn a ceasefire into a future. The war was over, the scars were deep, and the 20th century was packing its luggage for Versailles, where a group of men in frock coats were about to find out if they could be as brave with a pen as Alvin York had been with a rifle. The 11th hour had passed, and the silence was now the only sound left. But, as we shall see in the final chapter, the silence of 1918 was not an end. It was merely a deep breath before the next act began.
Chapter 20. 1919 is packing its luggage for Versailles,
By the time December of 1918 had finally dragged its weary, battle-scarred carcass to the edge of the calendar, the human race felt very much like a man who has just tumbled down a 3-story flight of stairs and is now lying on the sidewalk, squinting at the sun and wondering if his insurance policy covers acts of universal stupidity. The year had been a marathon of catastrophes, a relentless parade of lid, virus, and geographical remodeling, and we were all quite ready to turn the page, provided the next page wasn't currently being used to wrap a stick of dynamite. The year 1918 did not leave the room quietly. It lingered by the door, much like a guest who has stayed long past his welcome, broken the piano, and is now asking if you happen to have a spare cigar and a light. It left behind a world that was quieter, certainly, but it was the silence of a house that has just been hit by a cyclone. The dust was still settling, the neighbors were still arguing over whose fence was whose, and the Spanish lady was still in the hallway, letting out the occasional ominous sneeze just to remind us that she hadn't quite finished her tour of the upholstery. The lingering specter. As the Christmas bells rang out, sounding a bit thin and tinny perhaps, given that most of the church bells in Europe had been melted down to make cannons, the pandemic remained the silent partner in every household. It was the great equalizer of 1918. It didn't care if you were a private in the trenches or a prince in a palace. It treated every human lung with the same democratic indifference. We had learned to live in a world of muffled faces and suspicious glances. A simple cough in a crowded street was now greeted with the kind of horrified silence previously reserved for a man who had just admitted to being a secret admirer of the Kaiser. We were a species in mid-shudder, waiting for the fever to break and for the air to be clear once more. The war for the planet was over, but the war for the breath was still being fought in every parlor and infirmary from Boston to Bombay. The Professor's Great Voyage. While the rest of us were busy looking for aspirin and coal, Woodrow Wilson was busy looking for his suitcase. On the 4th of December, the President of the United States boarded the SS George Washington, a massive liner that had been refitted with enough mahogany and idealistic fervor to sink a lesser vessel. Wilson was doing something that no sitting president had ever dared to do. He was leaving the country to travel to Europe. Now, to the modern mind, a president traveling abroad is a routine affair, involving a great deal of security, a very large airplane, and a frantic search for a local dignitary to shake hands with. But in 1918, it was as if the Dalai Lama had decided to take up a career as a traveling salesman in Kansas. The American people viewed the Atlantic as a very large, very wet, "keep out" sign, and they were a bit uneasy about their chief executive heading over to the Old World to play poker with a group of professional cynics who had been practicing the game since the Crusades. Wilson, however, was undeterred. He stood on the deck as the ship steamed out of New York Harbor, clutching his 14 points like a man who has just found the secret recipe for eternal peace and is worried that someone might try to steal it before he reaches the kitchen. He was going to Paris to turn the 11th hour into a permanent century. He was going to build a League of Nations, a grand assembly where every country would be treated like a responsible adult, a theory that suggests Wilson had never actually attended a town council meeting or a faculty tea. The Hall of Mirrors. The destination was Versailles, a palace built by Louis XIV for the express purpose of making everyone else in the world feel like a pauper. It was a place of endless gardens, gilded fountains, and the famous Hall of Mirrors, a room so full of reflections that a man could literally watch himself becoming more self-important with every step he took. The Paris Peace Conference, which was preparing to open in January of 1919, was to be the grand finale of the 20th century's first act. It was to be a gathering of the victors, a club where the admission price was 10 million lives and a very large amount of national debt. The Germans, of course, were not invited. They were told to wait in the hall and keep quiet until the grown-ups had finished deciding how much of their furniture they were going to keep. The atmosphere in Paris was one of frantic, exhausted gaiety. The city was full of kings with no kingdoms, generals with no armies, and map-makers who were currently the most powerful people on earth. They sat in the cafes and the ballrooms, drinking expensive champagne and drawing lines through ancient mountain ranges as if they were playing a particularly high-stakes game of connect the dots. The French wanted security, reparations, and to make sure the Germans were so poor they couldn't afford to buy a slingshot, let alone a cannon. The British wanted to keep the seas, keep the trade, and keep the French from getting too powerful. The Italians wanted everything they had been promised in secret and a little bit of what everyone else had, too. The Americans wanted a league, a law, and a world where everyone behaved with the polite rectitude of a Presbyterian Sunday school. The packing of the luggage. As 1918 packed its bags, it threw in a few final mementos for the coming year. It packed the inverted Jenny, that upside-down airplane that proved we couldn't even print a stamp without defying gravity. It packed Raggedy Ann, the doll with a candy heart who reminded us that love was still a marketable commodity in a year of lead. It packed the devil dogs of Belleau wood and the lost battalion of the Argonne, ghosts of a courage that the world was still trying to comprehend. It also packed a certain sense of never again. We wanted to believe that this was the war to end all wars, a phrase that possesses a most unfortunate expiration date. We wanted to believe that we had learned our lesson, that we had seen the bottom of the pit and were now ready to start climbing toward the light. History, I have often noted, is a teacher who gives the test first and the lesson afterward, and in 1918, the test was so difficult that most of the students had decided to drop out and take up a career in something simpler, like professional lion taming or amateur suicide. The luggage of 1919 was heavy. It was full of debts that could never be paid, grievances that could never be settled, and a new map that featured countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia, nations that were currently blinking in the sunlight like newborns who have just realized they are expected to pay taxes and defend their borders. The final verdict. 1918 had survived its major surgery. The patient was off the table, the bleeding had stopped, and the bandages were being applied with a great deal of ceremony. But the scars were everywhere. You could see them in the eyes of the soldiers returning to Tennessee with Sergeant York. You could see them in the empty chairs at the dinner tables in Boston, where the Red Sox had won their last victory. And you could see them in the haunted, axe-wielding figure of the Kaiser in his Dutch garden. The year ended, as it had begun, with a mixture of profound absurdity and staggering tragedy. We had reached for the stars with our jennies and our wirelesses, only to find ourselves buried in the mud of the trenches and the sneezing of the flu. We had proven that man is the only animal capable of spending 4 years trying to kill his brother and then spending the next 40 years complaining about the cost of the funeral. But there was hope. There is always hope when a new year stands at the door, clutching its empty ledger and its fresh set of pencils. We believed that 1919 would be the year of the settlement. We believed that the 11th hour had brought us to a new dawn. As the clock struck midnight and the calendar flipped, the ghosts of the Red Baron, the Romanovs, and the sailors at Kiel faded into the mist of the past. The 20th century was 18 years old. It had finally reached its majority, and like most 18-year-olds, it was broke, hungover, and convinced that it knew better than its parents. The suitcases were at the door. The train was at the station. The hall of mirrors was waiting to show us our own reflections, whether we liked what we saw or not. The hilarious history of 1918 was finished, leaving behind a world that was laughing through its tears and wondering, with a certain whimsical dread, what 1919 had in its pockets. The war was over. The future was just beginning. And somewhere in the dark, a man was already thinking about a new way to fly an airplane. And this time, he was going to try and keep the wheels on the bottom.